You might stand at the threshold of this small mill room and notice first how the cold crept in through every gap between the rough-hewn planks, a cold that was not sharp or biting, but rather a deep and settled chill that seemed to have lived in the walls for 100 winters before this one. Eadgifu wore a dress of coarse brown wool with a linen wimple wrapped around her head and tucked into the neck of her garment, and over this she had pulled a second woolen wrap that fell heavy against her shoulders and arms. Her hands were bared because gloves made the grip on the wooden handle uncertain, and because she had learned long ago that the friction of the turning motion would keep the blood moving in her fingers well enough. The handle itself was a length of oak, smoothed by years of palms until it shone a darker brown in the light of the single oil lamp that sat on a shelf carved into the earthen wall. That lamp was a simple clay bowl with a twisted rush wick floating in rendered tallow, and its flame was small and steady and orange, and it pushed back the darkness only far enough to illuminate the circle of her work, and nothing more. The quern itself was a simple machine made of 2 stones that fit one atop the other, like a heavy and immovable puzzle. The bottom stone was fixed into the wooden frame, and its upper surface had been dressed with shallow grooves that spiraled outward from a central hole. The top stone, the runner, was the one she turned, and it was just as heavy as the first, a thick disk of grey millstone grit that had been quarried from a hillside many miles away and brought here on a cart pulled by oxen, in a time when the village had more to eat and more to hope for. Through the centre of the runner there was a hole called the eye, and it was into this eye that Eadgifu would tip small measures of grain from a wooden bowl that sat on the floor near her left foot. The grain she poured this morning was a mixture of rye and barley, the last of the stores that had been set aside for the darkest part of the year, when the snow lay thick on the fields, and the animals were fed on straw, and the children's faces grew thin and watchful. The rye was a darker grey than the barley, and it smelled faintly of earth and damp straw, even though it had been dried carefully on racks above the hearth in the autumn. The barley was paler and harder, and made a slightly different sound when it fell into the eye of the stone, a sound like tiny pebbles rattling down a wooden chute before they were swallowed by the darkness between the 2 grinding surfaces. Eadgifu leaned into the handle and began her circle. Her feet moved in a path she had worn into the packed earth floor over the course of many winters, a path that was smooth and shallow and slightly dusty where the flower that had fallen in months past had been trodden into the soil. Her right hand gripped the wooden handle that projected from the side of the runner stone, and her left hand rested lightly on the edge of the frame for balance. And then she walked. It was not a hurried walk, because there was no purpose in hurrying, when the work would take as long as it took, and when the only measure of time was the growing pile of coarse flour that collected in the wooden trough around the base of the quern. She walked slowly and steadily, and her body moved in the rhythm that had become as natural to her as breathing, a rhythm that required no thought and asked no questions of the mind that might otherwise wander into the cold and hungry places beyond the walls. Step with the right foot and pull the handle forward. Step with the left foot and let the handle come around, and then the right foot again and the handle again, and the stone turning and the grain cracking, and the sound of it all filling the small room with a low and continuous presence that was almost like the voice of the building itself speaking in a language of friction and weight. The grain that she had poured into the eye a few moments ago was now being drawn down between the stones by the force of the turning and by the spiral grooves that guided it outward from the center. You could hear the change in the sound as the hard kernels met the resistance of the stone, a change from the clean rattle of the pour to a deeper crunching that was muffled by the weight pressing down from above. Then, as she continued to walk and the grain moved farther out toward the edges of the stones, the sound softened into a steady hissing grind that was like the noise of a distant waterfall heard through thick walls. The crushed grain, now a coarse meal of broken rye and barley, emerged from the narrow gap between the stones all around the circumference of the quern and fell in a fine continuous curtain into the wooden trough below. Eadgifu would pause her walking every few circles to take up a small flat paddle of beechwood and push the accumulating meal toward the front of the trough where it could be scooped more easily into a waiting bowl. She did this without breaking the rhythm of her steps entirely. A brief hesitation in the forward motion and the leaning of her weight to the side as her free hand did its simple work, And then she was walking again, and the handle was moving again, and the stone was turning again, and the sound of the grind filled up the space where any other thought might try to grow. The lamp on the shelf flickered once, when a small draught found its way through the crack beneath the door, a draught that carried with it the smell of snow and the faint sour tang of wood smoke from the hall's hearth. Edgifu did not look up at the lamp because she knew its habits well enough to trust that it would steady itself once the draught passed. Instead, she watched the meal falling, and she watched the place where her hand met the wood of the handle, and she listened to the sound of the stone, and she felt the cold air on her cheeks and the warmth of her own movement in her shoulders and arms. Her mind had settled long ago into the same steady pace as her feet, a pace that did not hurry toward any destination and did not look back at any starting point, but simply existed in the endless present of the turning stone. She thought about the grain sometimes, but not in any complicated way, just a simple awareness of its color and texture and the amount that remained in the sack that hung from a peg on the wall. The sack was woven from coarse hemp, and it was only a third full now, and when she had begun grinding before the first light, it had been perhaps half full, and by the time the light came fully through the small unglazed window, high in the east wall, it would be less than a third, and by the time the noon meal was prepared in the hall, it would be nearly empty. Then she would take the meal she had ground, and she would sift it through a sieve of woven horsehair to separate the fine flour from the coarser bran and the hard fragments of husk that the stone had not reduced, and the fine flour would go into another sack for the baking of flat loaves on the hearthstone, and the bran would be set aside for porridge that would stretch the stores a little further into the hungry weeks ahead. The light did come eventually, a slow grey brightening that seeped through the high window and made the lamp's small flame seem suddenly yellow and unnecessary. The window was nothing more than a narrow opening cut between two of the wall studs with a piece of oiled linen stretched across it to keep out the worst of the wind, and the light that came through was diffuse and watery, and it fell on the opposite wall in a pale rectangle that moved almost imperceptibly as the sun climbed behind the thick winter clouds. Edgifu saw this light arrive without looking directly at it, noticing instead the way the shadows in the corners of the room softened, and the way the texture of the wattle wall became more visible, and the way the dust motes that floated in the still air caught the new brightness and glowed like tiny specks of meal themselves. She kept walking her circle, and the stone kept turning and the meal kept falling into the trough, a fine greyish-brown powder that smelled nutty and clean and slightly sweet from the barley. The rye contributed a deeper earthiness to the aroma, a smell that reminded her of the fields in late summer when the grain heads were heavy and bent, and the wind moved through them in waves that made a rustling sound, not unlike the sound of the quern, but softer and wider and full of the warmth of the sun. That warmth was a distant memory now in the cold of this winter, a memory that she did not dwell on, but simply noted in the same way she noted the position of the handle in her grip, or the slight ache in her lower back that came from leaning forward into the work hour after hour. Her back did ache, a dull and familiar sensation that settled in the muscles on either side of her spine and radiated outward toward her shoulders and hips. It was not a sharp pain, but a slow and steady presence that she had learned to accommodate by shifting her weight slightly as she walked, favoring first one leg and then the other, and letting the motion of the turning work out some of the stiffness, even as it created more. She thought about the meal she would make from this grinding, a flatbread of rye and barley flour mixed with a little water and a pinch of salt and baked on a hot stone near the hearth coals. The bread would be dense and dark, and it would fill the belly in a way that lasted longer than the lighter breads of wheat flour that no one in the village had tasted since the autumn before the famine began. There would be no leavening in this bread, because the sourdough starter that had been kept alive in a clay pot near the hearth for generations had finally died in the deep cold of the previous month when the fire had been allowed to burn too low one night. Edgifu remembered the morning she had found the starter cold and still and grey, and she had felt a small quiet grief that she had not spoken aloud, because there were larger griefs now and no room for the smaller ones. But the flatbread would still be bread, and it would still be food, and it would still be something to give the children when they looked up with their pale faces and asked in their small voices if there would be anything to eat before the next sleep. The grinding continued, and the light from the window moved across the wall and down toward the floor, and the sack of grain on the peg grew lighter, and the bowl of ground meal on the floor grew heavier. Edgifby paused once to pour more grain into the eye of the stone, and as she did so she saw the kernels fall into the darkness and disappear with a soft rustling sound. And then she was walking again, and the handle was moving again, and the stone was turning again. Her feet followed the worn path in the earth, and her breath made small clouds in the cold air, and the lamp on the shelf burned steadily, now without flickering, because the draught had settled and the air in the small room had grown still again. The only sounds were the grind of the stone and the soft scuff of her shoes on the packed dirt and the occasional dry whisper of the meal sliding down into the trough, and the distant muffled sounds from the hall where others were beginning to stir and move about in the grey morning. A child coughed somewhere beyond the wall, and the sound was small and quick, and then gone. A log shifted in the hearth fire and sent a crackle through the timber frame. A voice murmured something too low to understand, and another voice answered in the same low tone, and then there was silence again, except for the turning of the stone and the walking of the woman. She had been a miller's wife for more winters than she could easily count, not because the number was so large, but because the years had a way of running together when they were marked only by the changing of the seasons, and the grinding of the grain, and the baking of the bread. She had come to this village from another one that lay a day's walk to the south, a village that had its own mill and its own miller, and its own familiar rhythms of work and rest. She had married the miller of this place when she was young and strong, and full of the hope that young people carry with them like a small flame, sheltered from the wind. That hope had not been extinguished exactly, but it had been worn down over time, the way the grooves in the millstone were worn down by the endless passage of grain, becoming shallower and smoother and less distinct, but still present and still doing their work. The miller himself was not here this morning because he had gone with 2 other men to the woods to the east, where they were cutting deadfall and dragging it back to the village for fuel, a task that took most of the daylight in these short winter days and left him tired and quiet and smelling of pine resin and cold sweat when he returned. So the grinding fell to Gifu as it often did, and she did not mind the work because it was work that needed doing, and because the turning of the stone was a kind of company in the long hours when the hall was quiet and the children were still asleep under their piles of wool blankets and hides. The bowl beneath the trough was nearly full now, and Edgifby stopped her walking to lift it and carry it to the small table that stood against the wall near the door. The table was made of rough planks set on trestles, and its surface was covered with a fine layer of pale dust that had settled there over the course of the grinding. She set the bowl down and took up the sieve that hung from a nail on the wall, a round frame of bent willow with a mesh of woven horsehair stretched tight across its bottom. She poured some of the ground meal into the sieve and began to shake it gently from side to side, a motion that was smaller and quicker than the walking of the quern, but that had its own steady rhythm and its own quiet sound. The fine flour fell through the mesh in a soft, pale drift onto a piece of clean linen spread on the table, and the coarser bits of bran and husk remained in the sieve and were dumped into a separate wooden bowl for the porridge pot. She worked through the whole bowl of meal this way, shaking and sifting and pouring and shaking again, and the pile of fine flour grew slowly, and the pile of bran grew slowly, and the light from the window continued its slow journey across the wall and down toward the floor. When the sifting was done, she carried the linen of fine flour to the storage chest that stood in the corner of the mill room, a chest of oak with iron hinges that held the village's precious store of ground meal against the hunger of the winter days. She lifted the heavy lid and poured the flour into the chest, where it joined a larger pile of the same greyish-brown powder, and then she closed the lid and wiped her hands on the front of her woolen dress and went back to the quern. The sack of grain on the peg was lighter still now, and she could see the bottom of the sack beginning to show through the remaining kernels, a dart shape against the coarse hemp weave. She poured another measure of rye and barley into the eye of the stone and watched it disappear, and then she placed her right hand on the wooden handle and her left hand on the frame for balance, and she began to walk again. The sound of the grinding rose up once more, and filled the small room and spilled out through the cracks in the walls and the gap beneath the door, and joined the other sounds of the village waking into the grey winter day, the sound of an axe splitting wood somewhere nearby, and the sound of a cow lowing from the beery, and the sound of a cow lowing from the byre, and the sound of a woman's voice calling to a child, and the sound of the wind stirring the bare branches of the older trees that grew along the frozen stream. And through all of it the steady low turning of the stone continued, endless and patient, a sound that had been heard in this place for as long as anyone could remember, and would be heard again tomorrow and the day after, and all the days until the grain was gone, and the famine ended, or did not end. Gifu warped her circle, and the handle moved under her hand, and the stone turned, and the meal fell, and the cold sat in the corners of the room, and the lamp burned its small steady flame, and the light from the high window crept down the wall toward the floor, and the morning passed into afternoon in the slow and quiet way that winter mornings always passed, one step following another, and the stone turning and the woman walking, and the work of survival continuing without hurry or drama, or any sound louder than grind of rye and barley, becoming and something to coint to breed quint for photos and then you band they there ever at a dying that sprun. The light that came through the high window in the mill room never grew strong enough to be called bright, not even at the height of the short winter day when the sun was supposed to be at its peak behind the endless ceiling of grey cloud. Instead, the lights remained dim and watery, and it seemed to collect in certain places, while leaving others in a deep and settled shadow that no amount of squinting could penetrate. Gifu had finished the first grinding of the morning, and the meal had been sifted and stored, and the quern sat quiet for a moment while she turned her attention to the next part of the daily work. The careful measuring of the grain that would be ground before the evening meal was prepared. This measuring was not a hurried task, and it was not a task that could be done with anything less than complete attention, because the grain in the sacks was all the grain that remained for the village until the spring planting and the summer growing and the autumn harvest, and each handful that was taken from the sack was a handful that could not be replaced until the earth warmed and the seeds sprouted, and the long slow work of growing began again. You might stand near the door of the mill room and watch as Eadgif moved to the wall where 3 sacks hung from heavy wooden pegs driven deep into the wattle and daub. The sacks were made of coarse hemp, and they were mottled with dark stains from years of use and from the natural oils of the grain that had seeped into the fibers over countless seasons. The first sack held the rye, a grain that was darker and more strongly flavored than wheat, and that grew well in the thin soils of this northern place. The second sack held the barley, paler and rounder and slightly softer to the touch. The third sack had once held oats, but it was empty now and had been empty for many weeks, its fabric limp and dusty against the wall and its mouth tied shut with a length of twine, as if closing it would somehow preserve the memory of what it had contained. Gifu did not look at the empty sack for longer than a glance, because there was no purpose in looking at what was gone, and because the rye and the barley were still there, and they needed to be measured with care and with an eye toward the long weeks that still lay ahead before the first green shoots of spring would appear in the fields. The measuring was done with a small wooden cup that had been carved from a piece of beechwood by the miller himself in a winter much like this one, but long before the famine had settled over the land like a heavy blanket that would not be lifted. The cup was smooth and dark from the oils of many hands, and from the fine dust of many thousands of grains that had passed over its rim. It held exactly enough grain to fill the eye of the quern twice over, a measure that Gifu knew by feel and by weight and by the particular sound the grain made when it fell into the wooden bowl that sat waiting beneath the spout of the quern's frame. She lifted the cup from its hook on the wall and held it in her left hand, while her right hand loosened the tie that closed the mouth of the rye sack. The tie was a simple loop of leather passed through a wooden toggle, and it came free with a soft tug that made the sack shift slightly against the wall and release a small puff of grain dust that hung in the dim air for a moment before settling back onto the hemp fibers. The opening of the sack revealed the rye within, a mass of grayish-brown kernels that caught the faint light from the window and reflected it back in 1,000 tiny dull gleams. Gifu reached into the sack with the wooden cup and scooped it full, drawing the cup back out and leveling the top with a single finger that swept across the rim and knocked the excess kernels back into the sack. She held the cup up near her face, not because she needed to see it better, but because the gesture was old and familiar, and it gave her a moment to feel the weight of the grain in her hand, and to think about what that weight meant. for the day ahead. The cup held enough rye to make perhaps 2 small flatbreads, 2 thin rounds of dense dark bread that would be divided among many mouths and that would provide only a small easing of the hunger that lived in every belly in the village. She poured the rye into the wooden bowl that sat on the floor near the quern, and then she reached into the sack again and scooped another cupful and leveled it, and poured it, and then a third and a fourth, until the bowl held the right amount of grain for the next long session of grinding. The barley was measured next, and the process was the same, but the feel of the grain was different in her hand. The barley kernels were plumper than the rye, and they slid against each other with a smoother sound when the cup pushed into the sack, a sound like tiny beads of polished wood pouring through a narrow space. The color of the barley was a pale gold in the dim light, a color that seemed to hold a memory of the summer sun that had ripened it in the fields above the village. And Gifu noticed this color without dwelling on it in the same way she noticed the cold air on her cheeks or the ache in her shoulders from the morning's grinding. She measured 4 cups of barley into the bowl where it mixed with the rye in a pattern of dark and light that would be ground together into a single flour of middling color and earthy taste. The proportion of rye to barley was not fixed by any strict rule, but was determined instead by what remained in each sack and by a long experience of how the 2 grains worked together to make a bread that was neither too dense nor too crumbly and that would hold together on the hot stone of the heart. When the measuring was done, Gifu tied the mouths of both sacks and hung the wooden cup back on its hook and stood for a moment in the stillness of the mill room, while the dim light from the window continued its slow creep across the opposite wall. The bowl of mixed grain sat on the floor near her feet, and she looked down at it and saw the way the kernels caught the light in different ways, the rye absorbing it and the barley reflecting it, and she thought about nothing in particular except the weight of the bowl and the work that lay ahead, and the sound that the quern would make when she poured the first measure into the eye of the stone. The mill room was quiet now in a way that it had not been quiet while the stone was turning. A deep and settled silence that seemed to press against her ears from all sides. She could hear the distant sounds of the village through the walls, the muffled thump of an axe splitting wood, and the low murmur of voices from the hall, and the occasional creak of the timber frame, as the cold outside pulled at the joints and made the whole building shift and settle. But inside the mill room there was only the sound of her own breathing and the faint rustle of her woolen dress as she moved, and the near silence of the grain waiting in the bowl. She did not begin grinding immediately, because there was another measure that needed to be taken before the stone could start turning again. This was a measure not of grain, but of the meal that had been ground in the morning and stored in the oat chest in the corner. The chest held the flour that would be used for the day's baking, and for the porridge that would be made in the evening, and for the small reserve that was always kept back against some future need that could not be foreseen, but that everyone in the village knew would come eventually. Gifu crossed the small room to the chest and lifted the heavy lid, and looked down at the pile of greyish-brown flour that lay within. The flour was not a single, uniform color, but was streaked with lighter and darker patches where the rye and barley had not been perfectly mixed in the grinding and sifting, and the surface of the pile was marked with the smooth hollow where she had scooped out the morning's portion for the flatbreads that had been baked at dawn. The hollow was shallow, and it showed the texture of the flour beneath the surface, a fine soft powder that clung to itself in small clumps and that released a faint nutty smell into the cold air of the room. She did not need to count the flour in any precise way, because she knew by looking how much remained and how much would be needed for the evening meal, and how many days the chest would last if the weather stayed cold, and the hunting stayed poor and the fish stayed frozen beneath the ice of the stream. This knowledge was not written down anywhere because there was no one in the village who could read or write, and because the knowledge lived instead in her hands and her eyes, and the deep familiar awareness that came from doing the same work day after day through winters that were sometimes lean and sometimes less lean, but never plentiful. She closed the lid of the chest gently so that the sound of the wood meeting wood was soft and muffled, and then she straightened and looked toward the window where the dim light was beginning to take on a slightly different quality, a subtle shift toward the greyish gold that meant the brief noon hour was approaching. The noon hour was a time when the work of the village slowed but did not stop entirely, a time when the children who were old enough to walk would come in from their small tasks of gathering kindling or checking the snares, and would stand near the hearth in the hall and wait for the flatbread that would be divided among them. Gifu would bring a measure of flour from the chest to the hall for this noon bread, and she would mix it with water from the clay pot that sat near the hearth, and she would knead it briefly on a smooth stone, and then she would press it flat and lay it on the hot hearthstone to bake. The bread would be small and thin, and it would be eaten quickly, and then the children would go back out into the cold and the adults would return to their work, and the afternoon would pass in the same slow way that the morning had passed, marked only by the turning of the quern and the falling of the meal and the gradual emptying of the bowl of mixed grain on the floor. But before she could take the flour to the hall, there was the matter of the small wooden scoop that she used to portion out the day's baking. The scoop hung from a nail on the wall near the chest, and it was smaller than the measuring cup she used for the whole grain, a shallow curve of carved alder wood that held just enough flour to make a single flat bread. Gifu took the scoop down and lifted the lid of the chest again, and pushed the scoop into the pile of flour and drew it out level with the rim. The flour in the scoop was a pale greyish brown, and it clung together in a soft mound that held the shape of the scoop's curve when she turned it over into a smaller wooden bowl that she would carry to the hall. She filled the scoop 3 times, and each time she leveled it with the same careful motion of her finger across the rim. And then she closed the chest and hung the scoop back on its nail, and picked up the small bowl of flour and stood for a moment at the door of the mill room, while the cold air from the gap beneath the door wrapped around her ankles and made her shift her weight from one foot to the other. The door of the mill room was not a proper door with iron hinges, but a simple panel of rough planks held together by 2 horizontal battens and fitted into the opening of the wall. It swung on leather straps that creaked softly when she pushed it open and stepped out into the narrow passage that connected the mill room to the main hall. The passage was dark and cold, and it smelled of damp earth and old straw, and the faint sour tang of the animals that were kept in the byre at the far end of the building. Gifu walked through the passage with the bowl of flour held against her chest, and her feet finding their way by memory over the uneven ground that had been packed hard by generations of footsteps. The light grew slightly stronger as she approached the hall, because the hall had a larger hearth and a smoke hole in the roof, and the fire that burned there sent a warm orange glow into the space that pushed back against the grey dimness of the winter day. The hall was a single long room with a floor of packed earth and walls of wattle and daub, and a roof of thick thatch supported by heavy timber posts that rose from the floor and disappeared into the shadows above. The hearth was a ring of stones in the centre of the floor, and a low fire burned there with a few lengths of alder wood that crackled and popped and sent thin streams of smoke up toward the hole in the roof. Around the hearth several people were gathered, their faces lit by the firelight, and their bodies wrapped in woolen cloaks and hides against the cold that filled the hall even with the fire burning. There was an old woman with white hair escaping from her linen wimple, who sat on a low stool and worked a drop spindle with slow and steady hands, the wool twisting into thread in a motion that was almost as old as the grinding of grain. There was a young woman with a baby at her breast who sat on a pile of straw and watched the fire with eyes that were heavy and distant. There were 3 children of varying sizes who sat on the floor near the hearth and looked up when Gifu entered with the bowl of flour, their faces pale and their eyes bright in the firelight, and their small hands reaching out without words toward the promise of food. Gifu crossed to the hearth and set the bowl of flour down on a flat stone that served as a work surface for the baking. She took the clay pot of water that sat warming near the edge of the fire and poured a small amount into the flour, just enough to make a stiff dough that would hold together when pressed flat. Her hands worked the dough with motions that were quick and practiced, folding and pressing and turning until the flour and water had become a single mass of greyish-brown paste that was smooth on the outside and slightly sticky within. She divided the dough into 3 equal portions and shaped each one into a flat round that was no thicker than her smallest finger, and then she laid the rounds carefully on the hot stone that had been heating near the coals. The stone was a smooth, flat piece of slate that had been in the village for as long as anyone could remember, and it held the heat of the fire in a way that baked the bread slowly and evenly without burning it. The dough began to change almost immediately when it touched the hot stone. the surface drying and firming and taking on a slightly darker color, while small bubbles formed and broke in the thin places where the dough was not perfectly even. The smell of baking bread rose into the air of the hall, and mixed with the smell of wood smoke and wool, and the cold, clean scent that seeped in through the walls. And the children watched the bread with their bright eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing to say when food was cooking and hunger was waiting. Edgifu stood by the hearth and turned the flatbreads once with a flat stick of wood, so that both sides would bake evenly, and when they were done she lifted them from the stone and set them on a wooden board to cool for a moment before they were divided. The bread was dark and dense, and it steamed in the cold air of the hall, and she broke each round into pieces that she handed to the waiting hands of the children and the old woman and the young woman with the baby. The pieces were small and they were eaten quickly, and then the hands were empty again, and the hunger was still there beneath the small warmth that the bread had left behind. Edgifu ate a piece herself, and felt the dense crumbs soften against her tongue and slide down her throat with a warmth that spread into her chest, and then faded almost immediately, leaving behind only the memory of having eaten, and the knowledge that the next meal was many hours away. She gathered the wooden board and the empty bowl and carried them back through the dark passage to the mill room, where the quern sat waiting, and the bowl of mixed grain sat on the floor, and the dim light from the high window had shifted again, moving now toward the corner where the oak chest stood, and taking on the slightly bluer tone that meant the afternoon was advancing toward the early darkness of winter. She set the board and bowl on the table near the door, and then she walked to the quern and stood for a moment with her hand resting on the smooth wooden handle, and her eyes looking down at the eye of the stone where the grain would soon disappear into the grinding darkness. The mill room was cold again after the relative warmth of the hall, and she could feel the chill settling into her shoulders and the back of her neck where the woolen wrap did not quite cover. She pulled the wrap closer and tucked the ends under her arms, and then she bent to pick up the bowl of mixed grain and poured a small measure into the eye of the stone and watched the kernels slide down into the darkness and disappear with a soft rustling sound that was quickly swallowed by the heavy silence of the waiting stones. Then she placed her right hand on the wooden handle and her left hand on the frame for balance, and she began to walk, slowly and steadily, around the worn path in the packed earth floor. The stone turned and the sound of the grinding rose up and filled the room and spilled out through the walls, and joined the other sounds of the village. In the dim grey afternoon, the sound of the axe still splitting wood somewhere beyond the byre, and the sound of the wind stirring the thatch of the roof, and the sound of the wind stirring the thatch of the roof, and the sound of a child's voice calling out and then falling silent. And through it all the steady low turning of the stone continued, and the meal began to fall into the wooden trough, and the light from the high window crept across the wall and down toward the floor, and the afternoon passed into evening in the slow and quiet way that winter afternoons always passed, one step following another, and the stone turning and the woman walking and the work of measuring and grinding and baking, continuing without end, and without hurry in the dim light of the famine winter. The sacks hung from the wooden pegs on the mill-room wall like three silent sentinels that asked for nothing and gave only what was taken from them by careful hands. Two of the sacks still held their contents and one did not, and the difference between the full and the empty was something that could be seen in the way the hemp fabric draped against the wattle and daub, in the way the pegs bore the weight of the grain, in the way the dust settled on the surfaces below. Edgifu had been aware of these sacks for so many years that she no longer thought about them in any conscious way, yet her body knew them as it knew the handle of the quern and the curve of the measuring cup and the particular cold that seeped through the wall near the door. The sacks were part of the room in the same way that the stones of the quern were part of the room, fixed and reliable and heavy with the purpose of sustaining life through the dark months when the fields gave nothing and the stream gave nothing and the forest gave only the dead wood that could be dragged back to the village for fuel. You might look at the pegs themselves and notice that they were not all the same. The peg that held the rye sack was the thickest of the three, a length of oak that had been driven into a hole bored through one of the wall studs, and that projected outward at a slight upward angle so that the weight of the sack would press it more firmly into the wall rather than pulling it out. The wood of this peg was dark with age and smooth where the hemp of the sack had rubbed against it over countless seasons of being lifted on and lifted off, and there was a shallow groove worn into its upper surface that marked the exact place where the tie of the sack always rested. The peg that held the barley sack was slightly thinner and made of ash, a pale wood that had taken on a greyish patina from the grain dust that had settled into its pores over time. The third peg was the smallest, and it was made of hazel, and it held nothing now except the empty sack that hung limp and dusty, and seemed to wait with a kind of patient hopelessness for a harvest that was still many months away. Edgifew had lifted the rye sack from its peg earlier that morning when she had measured out the grain for the day's first grinding, and she had felt the weight of it in her arms and against her chest as she loosened the tie and reached inside with the wooden cup. The weight was not what it had been at the start of winter when the sack was full and heavy and required both hands and a careful stance to lift it onto the peg in the first place. At the start of winter, the rye sack had been so heavy that the miller himself had carried it from the storage pit and hung it on the peg while Edgifew steadied the bottom and guided the tie into place. Now the sack was lighter, much lighter, and she could lift it with one hand if she needed to, though she rarely did, because there was no reason to lift a sack that was hanging exactly where it needed to hang. The weight she felt when she reached inside to scoop the grain was the weight of the remaining kernels sliding against her fingers and filling the cup, and then falling away as she drew the measure out. And this weight was a language that she understood, without having to translate it into any kind of conscious thought. The weight of the grain in the sack was not a number, because there were no numbers in her world beyond the simple counting of cups and bowls and the days until the next thin meal. Instead, the weight was a sensation that lived in her hands and her shoulders and her lower back, a knowledge that came from lifting and carrying and pouring and from the long, slow emptying that happened over the course of the winter. When the sack was full at the start of the cold season, she could barely reach the bottom with her arm extended and her face pressed against the coarse hemp, and the grain that her fingers found there was deep and plentiful and made a sound like a heavy rain when she pushed her hand into it. As the weeks passed and the grinding continued, and the flatbreads were baked and eaten, and the porridge was cooked and eaten, and the children's faces remained thin and watchful, the level of the grain fell lower and lower, and the sound it made when she reached into the sack changed from a heavy rain to a light rain to a soft trickle that was almost silent. Now in the deep of the famine winter, the grain was low enough that she could see the bottom of the sack when she leaned close and peered into the opening, a dark circle of hemp visible beneath the remaining kernels that barely covered it. The barley sack hung beside the rye, and its story was much the same, though the grain itself was different in color and shape and in the way it felt against the skin of her palm. The barley had been more plentiful at the start of winter, because the barley crop had fared slightly better in the thin soil of the upper field than the rye had fared in the lower field, where the frost had come early and stayed late. But the barley was being consumed at the same rate as the rye, because the two grains were mixed together in the grinding, and because the flatbreads required both to hold their shape on the hot stone, and because the porridge was made from the bran and husks of both grains together. The barley sack was perhaps a third full now, and its weight when she reached inside was a soft, yielding weight that gave way easily under the pressure of the wooden cup, a weight that spoke of the days remaining in a voice that was quiet and steady and impossible to ignore. The empty sack on the hazel peg was a different kind of weight altogether, a weight that was not physical, but that pressed on the mind in a way that the full sacks did not. The empty sack had once held oats, a grain that made a porridge that was lighter and sweeter than the porridge made from barley and rye, and that the children had particularly favoured in the mornings before the cold set in. The oats had run out many weeks ago, and the sack had been empty ever since. But Edgifew had not taken it down from its peg, because there was no other use for the peg, and because taking the sack down would have been an acknowledgment that the oats were truly gone and would not return until the next harvest. The empty sack hung there in gathered dust, and sometimes when the wind pressed against the walls and made the whole building creak and settle, the empty sack would sway slightly on its peg and make a soft brushing sound against the wattle. This sound was the only voice that the empty sack had, and it spoke of absence and waiting and the long months ahead before the fields would green again. The pegs themselves were fixed into the wall with a kind of permanent intention that spoke of the years that had passed in this mill room. The oak peg had been driven into its hole by the miller's father long ago when the building was first raised and the quern was set in place and the first sacks of grain were hung to wait for the grinding. The ash peg had been added later, when the barley harvest had grown large enough to require its own sacks separate from the rye, and the hazel peg had been added last of all, when the village had begun to grow oats in a small plot near the stream. Edgifnu knew these stories not because anyone had told them to her in words, but because she had lived in this village long enough to see the pegs for what they were, markers of time and change, and the slow shifting of what the land could provide, and what the people could coax from it. She did not think about these stories often, because the work of the present was always there and required her full attention. But sometimes, when she stood in the dim light of the mill-room, with her hand resting on the handle of the quern and her eyes looking at the sacks on the wall, the weight of all those years would settle over her like a second woolen wrap, and she would feel the presence of the people who had stood in this same spot before her, and lifted these same sacks and felt this same grinding sound. The miller had made the pegs himself, and he had done so with the same careful hands that he used for all the wooden things in the village, the handles for the tools and the pegs for the cloaks and the small toys that he carved for the children from scraps of alder and willow. He had chosen the oak for the rye peg because oak was strong and would not split under the weight of a full sack, and he had chosen the ash for the barley peg because ash was slightly more flexible and would give a little under the load without breaking. The hazel peg was made from a branch that he had cut from the hedge that grew along the eastern edge of the village, a branch that was straight and true and that had peeled cleanly when he stripped the bark away with his knife. He had shaped each peg with long strokes of the blade, and then he had smoothed them with a piece of rough stone until they were pleasant to the touch and would not catch on the fibers of the hemp sacks. Eadgifu had watched him do this work on a summer evening when the light was long and golden, and the children were playing in the dust outside the hall, and she had felt a quiet satisfaction at the sight of his hands moving with such sureness and care over the simple wood. Now in the dim winter light, those same pegs bore the weight of the sacks, and the sacks bore the weight of the grain, and the grain bore the weight of the hunger that waited in every corner of the village. Eadgifu moved to the wall and stood before the rye sack, and reached up to touch the tie that held its mouth closed. The tie was a length of leather that had been cut from the hide of a cow that had died of old age many years ago, and it was soft and supple from the oils of the grain and from the constant handling. She loosened the tie and opened the mouth of the sack and looked inside at the remaining rye, the greyish-brown kernels that lay in a shallow layer across the bottom and that seemed to look back at her with a kind of mute patience. She did not need to grind more grain just yet, because the bowl from the morning's measuring still held enough for the next session of turning the quern. But she stood there anyway, and looked at the rye and let her eyes rest on the familiar sight of it. The light from the high window had shifted again while she had been standing there, and it now fell across the wall in a pale slant that touched the edge of the rye sack and made the hemp fibers glow with a faint warmth that was entirely an illusion. There was no warmth in this room beyond what her own body generated, as she walked the circle around the quern, and what the small lamp produced as it burned its steady flame on the shelf. The cold was a constant presence that lived in the walls and the floor and the stones of the quern, and that seeped into her bones, no matter how many layers of wool she wrapped around herself. But the sight of the grain in the sack gave her something that was not warmth exactly, but was more like a small, steady reassurance, a knowledge that there was still something here to be ground and baked and eaten, and that the day would pass as all days passed, and the night would come, and then another day, and the work would continue. She closed the mouth of the rye sack and tightened the leather tie and let her hand rest for a moment on the rough fabric before she turned to the barley sack and repeated the same small ritual. The barley was paler in the dim light, and it seemed to hold a memory of the summer sun in its golden hue, a memory that was both comforting and painful, in a way that she did not examine too closely. She looked at the barley and noted without counting that there was perhaps enough for 2 more weeks at the current rate of grinding, maybe 3 if the portions were made smaller and the flatbreads were made thinner and the porridge was made with more water and less meal. These calculations were not conscious arithmetic, but rather a kind of bodily knowing that lived in her hands and her stomach, and the deep familiar awareness of what was enough and what was not enough and what would have to be done when the enough ran out. The empty oat sack swayed slightly as she passed it on her way back to the quern, and she reached out without thinking and stilled its motion with a light touch of her fingers. The fabric was dusty and stiff, and it made a faint rustling sound that was quickly swallowed by the silence of the room. She stood for a moment with her hand on the empty sack, and she thought about the summer fields and the way the oats had rippled in the wind, and the sound the children had made when they ran through the tall stalks, and the feeling of the sun on her face, and the knowledge that all of that was gone now, and would not return for many months. Then she let go of the sack, and walked back to the quern, and placed her hand on the wooden handle, and felt the familiar smoothness of it against her palm. The bowl of mixed grain sat on the floor where she had left it, and the stone of the quern was still and silent and waiting. She poured a small measure of the grain into the eye, and watched it disappear into the darkness between the stones, and then she began to walk, slowly and steadily, around the warm path in the packed earth. The stone turned, and the sound of the grinding rose up, and filled the room and pushed back against the silence that had gathered there while she had been standing by the sacks. The meal began to fall into the wooden trough, and the dust rose in small pale clouds that caught the light from the window and drifted lazily toward the floor. The pegs on the wall held their weight, and the sacks hung in their places, and the empty sacks swayed slightly with the vibration of the turning stone, and then settled again into stillness. And Edgifu walked her circle, and the handle moved under her hand, and the stone turned, and the meal fell, and the coals sat in the corners of the room, and the lamp burned its small steady flame, and the weight of the sacks on the wooden pegs remained exactly what it was, neither more nor less, a quiet presence in the dim light that asked for nothing but was itself the answer to every question that the famine but was itself, the answer to every question that the famine posed. The meal that fell from between the stones of the quern was not yet flour, in the way that the village needed flour to be. It was a coarse mixture of crushed grain and broken husks, and fine powder and larger fragments that had escaped the full pressure of the turning runner, and it lay in the wooden trough around the base of the quern, in a low greyish-brown mound that grew slowly with each circle that Eadgifu walked. The meal had to be sifted before it could be used for the baking of flatbreads or the making of porridge, and the sifting was a separate task, with its own rhythm and its own sound and its own particular demands on the hands and the attention. The tool for this work was the sieve that hung from a nail on the wall near the door, a round frame of bent willow with a mesh of woven horsehair stretched tight across its bottom, and it was to this sieve that Edgifu turned when the bowl beneath the trough had filled with enough meal to make the sifting worth the interruption of the grinding. You might stand in the doorway of the mill room and watch as she lifted the full bowl from its place on the floor and carried it with both hands to the small table that stood against the wall. The table was rough and dark, and its surface was dusted with the pale powder of many previous siftings, a fine layer that clung to the wood and rose in small clouds when anything was set down upon it. Edgifu placed the bowl on the table, and then she reached up and took the sieve from its nail and held it in her left hand, while her right hand reached for the piece of clean linen that was kept folded on a corner of the table for this exact purpose. The linen was old and soft from many washings in the stream during the warmer months, and it was spread out flat on the tabletop to receive the fine flour that would fall through the mesh of the sieve. The sieve itself was a simple object that had been made by the miller's mother many years before Eadgifu had ever come to this village, and it bore the marks of its long use in the way the willow rim had darkened and smoothed, and in the way the horsehair mesh had worn thin in the center where the weight of the meal pressed down most heavily during the shaking. The horsehair came from the tails of the villagers' 2 horses, animals that were kept in the small pasture near the stream when the weather was warm and in the byre when the cold came, and the hair had been collected over many seasons and cleaned and sorted and woven into a mesh that was fine enough to let the flour through while holding back the coarser bits of bran and husk. The weaving of the mesh was a skill that few people possessed, and fewer still practiced, and the sieve was valued accordingly and handled with a care that reflected its importance to the daily work of survival. Eadgifu held the sieve over the linen, and with her free hand she scooped a portion of the ground meal from the bowl and poured it into the sieve. The meal was a mixture of pale barley flour and darker rye flour, and the small hard fragments of husk that the stones had not been able to reduce, and it sat in the sieve in a low mound that looked heavier than it actually was. She began to shake the sieve with a gentle side-to-side motion that was different from the walking of the quern, but that shared with it a quality of steady repetition and a sound that was all its own. The sound of the sifting was a soft rhythmic shushing that was punctuated by the faint patter of the fine flour falling through the mesh and landing on the linen below, a sound like a very light rain on a very still day, or like the whisper of dry leaves stirred by a wind that was barely strong enough to move them. This sound filled the small space between the table and the wall, and it mingled with the distant sounds of the village beyond the mill room, the muffled thump of the axe, and the low murmur of voices, and the creak of the timber frame settling into the cold. The motion of the shaking was not something that Edgipu thought about in any conscious way, because her hands had learned it long ago, and now performed it with the same automatic certainty that her feet used when walking the circle around the quern. She held the sieve with both hands now, her fingers curled around the smooth willow rim, and she moved it in a small ellipse that kept the meal in constant motion across the surface of the mesh. The heavier fragments of bran and husk rose to the top of the moving mass, while the finer flour sifted downward and fell through the tiny openings between the woven hairs. The flour that fell was a soft, pale cloud that settled on the linen in a layer that grew slowly thicker as the shaking continued, a layer that was slightly lighter in color than the original meal because the darker bran had been held back by the mesh. From time to time, Edgifu would stop shaking and tilt the sieve to one side so that the coarser material that had collected on top of the mesh could be dumped into a separate wooden bowl that sat on the table for this purpose. This coarse material was mostly the hard outer husks of the barley and rye grains, fragments that were too tough for the stones to crush completely, and that would not soften enough in the baking to be pleasant to eat in the flatbreads. But the husks were not wasted, because nothing in the village was wasted in this famine winter, and they would be added to the pot of water that hung over the hearth-fire to make a thin porridge that would stretch the stores a little further and provide at least the sensation of something warm in the belly before sleep. The husks made a different sound when they fell into the wooden bowl, a sharper and more percussive sound than the soft drift of the flour, a sound like tiny dry twigs snapping under a light footstep. The sifting continued, and the pile of fine flour on the linen grew, and the bowl of coarse husks grew, and the bowl of unsifted meal on the table grew smaller. Edgifu worked through the entire batch of ground meal that she had collected from the trough, scooping and shaking and dumping and scooping again, and the rhythm of the work settled over her like a second layer of wool against the cold. Her shoulders moved in a small, steady motion, and her breath made faint clouds in the dim air, and her eyes watched the surface of the sieve where the meal shifted and sorted itself into its separate parts. The light from the high window had moved again while she worked, and it now fell across the table in a pale slant that illuminated the fine dust that hung in the air and made it glow like a soft golden mist against the darker shadows of the walls. There was a particular satisfaction in the sifting that was different from the satisfaction of the grinding, though both were quiet and slow and asked for nothing more than the continued attention of the hands and the patience of the body. The grinding was about reduction and transformation, about taking the hard whole kernels and breaking them down into something that could be used. The sifting was about separation and refinement, about taking the mixture that the grinding had produced and dividing it into the part that would become bread, and the part that would become porridge, and the part that was nothing but dust that would settle on the table and the floor and the sleeves of her woolen dress. The dust was unavoidable, because the flour was fine and light, and it rose into the air with every shake of the sieve and drifted slowly downward to coat every surface in the mill room with a thin, pale film that built up over days and weeks until it was thick enough to write in with a finger. Edgifu did not write in the dust because there was nothing to write and because the marks would only be disturbed by the next day's work anyway. But sometimes when she paused in the sifting to dump the husks or to add more meal to the sieve, she would notice the patterns that the dust had made on the dark wood of the table, swirls and drifts and tiny ridges that followed the grain of the wood, and that looked like the ripples in the sand at the bottom of the stream in summer. These patterns were accidental and temporary, and they would be gone by the next morning, replaced by new patterns that were slightly different, but fundamentally the same. The dust was a record of the work that had been done in this room, a record that was constantly being written and constantly being erased, and that asked for no reader and left no lasting mark. When the last of the meal had been sifted, and the fine flour lay in a soft mound on the linen, and the bowl of husks was nearly full, Edgifu set the sieve aside and lifted the corners of the linen to gather the flour into a neat bundle that could be carried to the storage chest. The flour was warm from the friction at the sifting, and it held the shape of the linen when she lifted it, a soft and yielding weight that shifted against her hands as she crossed the small room to the chest. She opened the heavy lid and poured the flour into the chest where it joined the larger store of ground meal that waited for the next baking, and then she closed the lid and carried the linen back to the table and spread it flat once more. The bowl of husks she left where it was for the moment, because the husks would be taken to the hall later when the time came to start the porridge for the evening meal. The sieve now needed to be cleaned because the mesh would become clogged with fine particles if it was not cleared after each use, and a clogged sieve would not separate the flour from the bran properly, and the work of the next sifting would be slower and less effective. The cleaning was done by tapping the rim of the sieve gently against the edge of the table. A series of light sharp knocks that sent small puffs of flour dust into the air, and that loosened the particles that had become trapped between the woven horsehairs. Edgifu tapped the sieve on all sides, and then she held it up to the light from the window and looked through the mesh to be sure that it was clear. The light came through in 1,000 tiny points that were slightly hazy where the mesh was thickest, and brighter where the hairs had worn thin from long use, and the pattern of the light was familiar and reassuring in a way that required no thought. She hung the sieve back on its nail and stood for a moment with her hands resting on the edge of the table, and her eyes looking at the bowl of husks and the empty bowl that had held the unsifted meal and the folded linen and the fine layer of dust that covered everything. The mill room was quiet now that the shaking of the sieve had stopped, and the only sounds were the faint crackle of the lamp on the shelf, and the distant murmur of the village, and the soft sigh of the wind pressing against the walls. The quern sat silent in the center of the room, with its wooden handle pointing outward and its stones still and dark, and waiting for the next measure of grain to be poured into the eye. Edgifu could feel the cold beginning to settle more deeply into her shoulders and her hands, now that the motion of the sifting had ceased, and she knew that she would soon return to the grinding, because the grinding was the work that kept the cold at bay, and because there was more grain was the work that kept the cold at bay, and because there was more grain to be ground before the light failed entirely and the evening meal was prepared. But for a moment she remained where she was and let the stillness of the room settle around her. The rhythm of the sieve was still present in her hands and her arms, a faint echo of the motion that had occupied her for the past long while, and she could feel it fading slowly, like the sound of a bell that had been struck and was now returning to silence. The husks in the wooden bowl were a pale brown color that was slightly lighter than the rye and slightly darker than the barley, and they smelled faintly of the same earthy nuttiness that characterized all the grain in the village. They would make a thin porridge that would taste of very little except the memory of grain and the warmth of the water they were boiled in. But that small warmth and that small taste would be enough to carry the children through the long cold night, until the morning brought another measure of flour and another flat baked on the hot stone. Edgifu picked up the bowl of husks and carried it to the door and stepped through into the dark passage that led to the hall. The passage was cold, and it smelled of damp earth and old straw and the faint sourness of the animals in the byre, and her feet found their way over the uneven ground by memory and by the slight glow of firelight that seeped through the cracks around the door to the hall. She pushed the door open and entered the larger space where the hearth-fire burned low and orange and where several people sat or lay in the dim warmth, their faces turned toward the flames and their bodies wrapped in wool and hides against the cold that filled the hall even with the fire burning. She carried the bowl of husks to the clay pot that hung from an iron hook over the hearth, a pot that was half full of water that had been warming slowly through the afternoon, and she tipped the husks into the water and watched them spread across the surface and then begin to sink as the water soaked into their dry fibers. The porridge would cook slowly through the remaining hours of daylight and into the early darkness, and by the time the evening meal was ready, the husks would have softened enough to be eaten without too much effort, and the water would have thickened into a greyish-brown liquid that was more substantial than water, but less substantial than anyone in the village would have wished. She left the pot to its slow work and returned through the passage to the mill room, where the quern waited, and the lamp burned and the light from the high window had shifted yet again, moving now toward the corner where the oak chest stood, and taking on the deeper blue tone that meant the afternoon was advancing toward the early dusk of winter. She walked to the quern and placed her hand on the wooden handle and poured another small measure of grain into the eye and watched it disappear, and then she began to walk her circle once more. The stone turned and the sound of the grinding rose up, and the meal began to fall into the trough, and the dust rose in small clouds, and the rhythm of the work settled over her like a familiar weight. and in the corner of her awareness there was still the echo of the sieve's motion and the memory of the fine flour falling through the mesh, and the knowledge that the sifting would come again when the trough was full and the grinding was paused, and the work of separation and refinement began once more in the dim light of the mill room. The cold in the mill room was not a sudden thing that arrived with a gust of wind or a sharp drop in the temperature outside. It was a slow and steady presence that had been seeping into the building since the first frost of autumn, and that had never left, accumulating in the earthen floor and the wattle walls and the heavy stones of the quern until the entire room seemed to breathe cold rather than air. Edgifu had lived through enough winters in this village to know the cold as a familiar companion, one that asked for nothing but gave nothing, and that simply existed alongside the work and the waiting and the turning of the stone. The cold was in the walls before she woke each morning, and it was in the walls after she lay down each night, and it was in the walls during every moment between, a constant low hum of chill that vibrated through the timber frame and settled into the bones of anyone who stayed still for too long. You might stand in the mill room and try to locate the source of the cold and find that it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The walls themselves were made of wattle and daub, a construction of woven hazel rods plastered with a mixture of clay and straw and animal hair that had dried hard and cracked in places over the years. The daub was thick in some spots and thin in others, and where it was thin the cold passed through as easily as light passes through a linen window covering. Edgifu knew the thin spots by the way the air near them felt against her cheek when she walked past. A faint movement of colder air that was almost like the breath of some patient animal waiting just outside. There was a thin spot near the door where the daub had crumbled away from the wattle, and the woven rods were visible as a dark lattice against the lighter clay, and through this lattice the winter air moved freely and carried with it the smell of snow and frozen earth and the distant smoke from the hall's hearth. There was another thin spot on the wall that faced the north, the wall that never received any direct light from the low winter sun, and that seemed to hold the cold more deeply than the others. And when Edgifu stood near this wall, she could feel the chill pressing through her woolen dress and her linen shift, and settling against her skin like a second garment worn beneath the first. The floor of the mill room was packed earth that had been trodden hard by generations of feet walking the circle around the quern, and this earth held the cold in a way that the walls could not match. The cold came up from the ground beneath the building, a deep and ancient chill that had been stored in the soil since the previous winter, and that had never fully warmed, even in the brief months of summer. Edgifu could feel this cold through the thin leather of her shoes, a constant pressure against the soles of her feet that made her shift her weight from one foot to the other whenever she stood still. The shoes themselves were simple things made from a single piece of cowhide, folded and stitched with leather thong, and they offered little protection against the cold of the earth, except that they kept her feet dry and prevented the direct touch of frozen ground against bare skin. When she walked the circle around the quern, her feet warmed slightly from the motion and the friction, and this small warmth was enough to keep the cold from settling too deeply into her bones during the long hours of grinding. But when she stopped to sift the meal, or to measure the grain, or to carry the flour to the chest, the cold would return quickly, and she would feel it creeping up through her ankles and into her calves and settling in her knees like a dull and patient ache. The cold affected the grain as well, though the grain did not complain and did not shiver, and simply sat in its sacks and waited to be ground. The rye and the barley had been stored in the mill room since the harvest, and they had taken on the temperature of the room gradually and completely, so that when Edgifu reached into the sacks to scoop a measure of grain, the kernels felt cool and smooth against her fingers and seemed to draw the warmth out of her skin in a slow and steady transfer. The grain was not frozen because the mill room never grew quite cold enough for that, protected as it was by the shed wall with the hall where the hearth fire burned, and by the bodies of the animals in the byre, and by the thick thatch of the roof that held whatever small warmth rose from below. But the grain was cold enough that it felt like reaching into a pile of small smooth stones that had been lying in the shade of a north-facing slope since the autumn, and Edgifu's fingers would grow stiff and slow after she had scooped several measures, and she would pause to tuck her hands into her sleeves and press them against the warmer skin of her forearms until the feeling returned. The stones of the quern were the coldest things in the room, and they held the cold more deeply than anything else, because stone gives up its warmth slowly and takes on new warmth even more slowly. The bottom stone that was fixed into the wooden frame had not been truly warm since the previous summer, when the sun had shone through the open door and heated the mill room for a few brief hours each afternoon. The runner's stone that Edgip returned with the wooden handle was slightly warmer because the friction of the grinding generated a small amount of heat where the two stones met. But this heat was faint and local, and it dissipated almost immediately into the vast cold mass of the stone itself. When Eadgifu placed her left hand on the edge of the frame to steady herself as she walked, she could feel the cold of the stone through the wood, a deep and settled chill that seemed to come from the center of the earth itself, and that asked for nothing but was simply there, patient and eternal. The lamp on the shelf gave off a small warmth that was barely enough to feel unless you held your hand directly above the flame, and Eadgifu did this sometimes when her fingers grew too stiff to grip the wooden handle properly. She would pause in her walking and step over to the shelf and hold her open palms above the small orange flame and feel the faint heat rising against her skin, a warmth that was more suggestion than reality, but that was enough to loosen the tightness in her knuckles and restore some small measure of flexibility to her fingers. The lamp burned tallow rendered from the fat of sheep that had been slaughtered in the autumn before the famine had grown truly serious, and the tallow was hard and white, and it melted slowly in the heat of the burning rush wick. The smell of the burning tallow was faintly animal and slightly sweet, and it mixed with the smell of grain dust and cold earth and the distant smoke from the hall to create the particular atmosphere of the mill room, an atmosphere that Eadgifu no longer noticed unless she left the room and returned to it after some time in the slightly warmer air of the hall. The cold seeped through the wattle walls in ways that were visible if you knew where to look. On the north wall, there was a patch of daub that had cracked in a pattern like a spider's web, and in the center of this patch a thin layer of frost had formed during the coldest hours of the night and had not yet melted in the dim light of the day. The frost was white and delicate, and it traced the edges of the cracks in the daub like a careful drawing made by a hand that was too cold to hold a stick of charcoal. Eadgifu had noticed this frost many times, and she had watched it fade as the day progressed, and the small warmth of the lamp and the motion of the grinding raised the temperature of the room by a degree or two, and then she had watched it return in the night, when the fire in the hall burned low, and the cold pressed in from all sides, and the mill room became again a place where water would freeze if it were left in an open bowl. The frost was a reminder of the world outside, a world that was locked in the deep freeze of the famine winter and that would not release its grip for many weeks yet. The cold came through the roof as well, descending from the thatch above where the frost clung to every straw and made the whole roof gleam dully in the starlight before the dawn. The thatch was thick, and it had been laid by skilled hands many years ago, but no thatch could keep out the cold entirely, and the air near the ceiling of the mill room was always colder than the air near the floor. Eadgifu did not spend much time near the ceiling, because there was no reason to climb up into the rafters, where the spiders wove their webs and the dust of many years lay thick on the timbers. But she could feel the cold air settling downward as the day wore on, a slow and invisible current that moved from the thatch to the floor and that wrapped around her ankles and rose up her legs and made her grateful for the motion of the walking that kept the blood moving and the warmth generated. Her breath made small clouds in the air of the mill room, and these clouds hung for a moment before dissipating into the general dimness. The clouds were more visible near the lamp, where the light caught the moisture and made it glow briefly before it vanished, and Eadgifu watched them sometimes without really seeing them. Her eyes focused on the middle distance where the stone turned and the meal fell and the handle moved under her hand. The clouds of her breath were a measure of the cold, and they told her without words that the temperature in the room was low enough to turn water vapor into visible mist, low enough that a bowl of water left on the table would form a thin skin of ice on its surface by morning. She did not leave bowls of water on the table because the water for the baking and the porridge was kept in the hall near the hearth where it would not freeze, and she carried it to the mill room only when it was needed, and then she carried it back when the work was done. The cold affected the way the flour behaved during the sifting and the grinding. The fine particles of meal were dry and light, and they rose into the air more readily when the air was cold and dense, forming small clouds that hung longer and settled more slowly than they did in warmer weather. The flour that fell through the sieve was cold to the touch, and it seemed to draw the warmth from Eadgifu's fingers when she gathered it up in the linen cloth. a subtle transfer of heat that she felt as a faint numbing in her fingertips. The dough that she made from the flour and water in the hall was stiff and slow to come together because the flour was cold and the water was only lukewarm from its place near the hearth, and she had to knead it longer and press it harder to make it smooth and elastic. The flatbreads took longer to bake on the hot stone because the dough was cold when it went on, and the stone lost some of its heat to the cold air of the hall, and the bread that resulted was slightly denser and chewier than it would have been in warmer weather. Edgifu's body had adapted to the cold in ways that she did not think about, but that were real and measurable, if there had been anyone to measure them. Her skin had grown thicker and less sensitive to the touch of cold surfaces, and her hands could grip the wooden handle of the quern for long periods without discomfort, even when the wood itself was cold enough to feel like a piece of ice. Her blood moved differently in the cold, retreating from her fingers and her toes and her nose and gathering around the core of her body where it kept her heart and her lungs and her stomach warm enough to continue their work. She shivered less than she had when she was younger and new to the winters of this northern place, not because the cold was any less cold, but because her body had learned to conserve its warmth and to endure the chill without the wasteful motion of shivering. The shivering came only at night when she lay under the pile of wool blankets and hides in the hall, and the fire burned low and the cold pressed down from the thatch and up from the earth and in from the walls, and even then it was a gentle shivering that came in waves and passed and came again and did not keep her from the shallow sleep that was all anyone could manage in the deep of the famine winter. The cold was not the same in every part of the mill room, and Edgifu knew the warmer spots as well as she knew the colder ones. The warmest spot was directly above the lamp, where the heat of the flame rose in a narrow column and warmed the air just enough to be noticeable if she stood directly beneath it. The wall that adjoined the hall was slightly warmer than the other walls because the hearth fire on the other side sent a faint warmth through the wattle and daub, a warmth that was barely perceptible but that made a difference when she leaned against it during a pause in the work. The floor near the door was the coldest spot because the draught that came under the door flowed across it constantly, and Edgifu avoided standing there for longer than necessary. The quern itself was cold, except for the narrow gap between the stones where the friction of the grinding generated a small local warmth that could be felt as she placed her hand near the edge of the runner, a warmth that was faint and fleeting, but there was nonetheless a reminder that motion created heat, and that the work of the grinding was a work against the cold, as much as it was a work against hunger. The cold seeped into the wood of the table and the wood of the chest, and the wood of the handle and the wood of the pegs on the wall, and all of these wooden things held the cold and released it slowly, and felt cool and smooth under Edgifu's touch. The wooden cup that she used for measuring the grain was cold when she picked it up from its hook, and it warmed slightly in her hand as she used it, absorbing the heat of her palm and fingers until it felt almost neutral against her skin. Then she would hang it back on its hook, and it would cool again, returning to the temperature of the room and waiting for the next time she needed it. The wooden bowl that held the unsifted meal was cold, and the wooden bowl that held the husks was cold, and the wooden scoop that portioned the flour was cold. And all of these things were part of the general coldness of the mill room, in the same way that the stones and the walls and the earth floor were part of it. Edgifu did not think of the cold as an enemy or a hardship or anything that required a response beyond the simple responses of wearing wool and keeping in motion and staying close to the fire when the work allowed. The cold was simply the condition of the world in winter, and it had been the condition of the world in winter for as long as anyone could remember, and it would be the condition of the world in winter for as long as anyone could imagine. The famine made the cold harder to bear because there was less food in the bellies of the village and less fuel for the fire and less fat on the bones to insulate against the chill, but the cold itself was not different from the cold of other winters. It was the same cold that had frozen the stream and silenced the birds and driven the deer deep into the forest where the hunters could not follow, the same cold that had cracked the daub on the north wall and formed the frost on the thatch and made the breath visible in the dim air of the mill room. She walked her circle around the quern, and the handle moved under her hand, and the stone turned, and the meal fell, and the cold sat in the corners of the room, and seeped through the wattle walls, and settled into the earthen floor, and wrapped around her ankles, and rose up her legs, and pressed against her back, and her shoulders, and her cheeks. She did not hurry because hurrying would not warm her any faster, and because the work would take as long as it took, and because the only thing that mattered was the continued turning of the stone and the continued falling of the meal, and the continued small accumulation of flour in the chest that would become bread and porridge and another day of survival in the famine winter. The lamp burned on its shelf, and the light from the high window shifted and faded, and the cold remained, patient and eternal, and as much a part of the mill room as the stones themselves, a quiet presence that asked for nothing and gave nothing, and simply was. The sound that Eadgifu's shoe made against the wooden runner of the quern was not a sound that anyone would notice unless they were standing very close and listening very close and had nothing else to occupy their attention. It was a soft and regular sound, a quiet scuff that repeated with each step she took along the warm path in the packed earth floor, and it was so much a part of the general noise of the grinding that it nearly disappeared into the larger sound of the stone turning and the meal falling and the handle creaking faintly in its socket. Yet the sound was there, and it had been there for as long as she had been walking this circle, a steady rhythm that marked the passing of the moments in a way that the grinding itself could not, because the grinding was continuous and unbroken while the steps were discrete and countable, if anyone had cared to count them. You might stand near the quern and close your eyes and let the sounds of the mill room arrange themselves in your awareness, and after a time you would begin to separate the different layers of noise the way you might separate the fine flour from the coarse bran in the sieve. The lowest sound was the grinding itself, a deep and constant rumble that came from the place where the two stones met and that vibrated through the wooden frame and into the floor and up through the soles of your feet if you stood still enough. Above that sound there was the lighter hiss of the meal falling into the wooden trough, a sound like a distant waterfall heard through thick walls, or like the rustle of dry leaves stirred by a wind that never quite died. And above that sound, or perhaps alongside it, there was the soft scuff of Eadgifu's shoe against the runner board with each step she took, a sound that was so regular and so predictable that it became almost a kind of silence itself, a marker of time that was too steady to be noticed except when it stopped. The runner board was a length of oak that ran around the base of the quern's wooden frame, a board that was slightly raised above the level of the earthen floor and that served to keep the falling meal from scattering too widely. Eadgifu's left foot stepped onto this board with each circuit she made around the stone, not because the path required it, but because the path had worn itself into that exact shape over the years, and because her body had learned to place her foot there without any conscious direction. The board was smooth and dark, and it had been polished by the passage of countless feet over countless winters, until it shone faintly in the lamplight, like the surface of a still pond in the last light of evening. The shoe that struck this board was made of a single piece of cowhide, folded and stitched with leather thong, and it had molded itself to the shape of her foot over the months and years of wearing, until it was less a shoe and more a second skin of leather that protected her from the cold of the earth and the roughness of the wood. The sound that the shoe made was a soft brushing sound, followed by a faint tap as the sole met the board, and then another soft brush as the foot lifted and moved forward for the next step. It was a sound that had three parts if you listened closely enough, though Eadgifu herself never listened closely because she had heard it so many times that it had become part of the background of her existence, like the sound of her own breathing or the beat of her own heart. The first part was the faint whisper of the leather sole sliding across the packed earth just before it reached the runner board, a sound that was almost too quiet to hear and that blended into the general rustle of her woolen dress moving against her legs. The second part was the small dull tap of the shoe landing on the oak board, a sound that was slightly different depending on how much of her weight she was shifting onto that foot at that particular moment. The third part was the soft release as the shoe lifted away and the weight transferred to the other foot, a sound that was the reverse of the first part and that faded immediately into the next step and the next and the next. The rhythm of this sound was as steady as the turning of the stone itself, and it matched the rhythm of the handle moving under her right hand, and the rhythm of her breathing, and the rhythm of her breathing, and the rhythm of the meal falling into the trough. There were perhaps 3 of these steps for each full rotation of the runner stone, though the number was not exact because the quern turned at a speed that varied slightly with the resistance of the grain and the strength of her push and the small adjustments she made to her pace as the hours passed. The sound of the shoe was a little faster than the sound of the grinding in the way that a heartbeat is faster than the breath, a quick and regular pulse that lay beneath the slower and deeper pulse of the stone. Together they made a kind of music that had no melody and no variation, and that asked for nothing from the listener except to continue. And this was the music that filled the mill-room during all the hours that Edgifbu walked her circle and turned the stone and ground the grain into meal. The shoe itself was a simple thing that the miller had made for her in the autumn of the previous year, when her old shoes had worn through at the soles and could no longer keep out the damp of the earthen floor. He had taken a piece of cowhide that had been tanned with oak bark and smoked over a low fire until it was dark and supple and resistant to water, and he had cut it to the shape of her foot, using a pattern made from a piece of birch bark that he kept for this purpose. The stitching was done with a leather thong that he had cut from the same hide and that he had pulled tight through holes made with a bone awl, and the stitches were small and even, and they ran around the edge of the shoe in a line that was both functional and pleasing to look at. The shoe had no separate sole, but was simply a single piece of leather that wrapped around her foot and was gathered at the heel and the toe with more stitching, and it was held on by a leather lace that crossed over the top of her foot and tied around her ankle. When she first put the shoe on, it had been stiff, and it had rubbed against her heel and made a small sore that took several days to heal. But now it was soft and it fit her foot exactly, and it made the same sound against the runner board that the old shoe had made, and that the shoe before that had made, and that the shoe before that had made, and that all the shoes she had ever worn in this mill room had made. The sound changed slightly as the hours of grinding passed, and the shoe collected a fine layer of grain dust on its surface. The dust was dry and light, and it muffled the tap of the leather against the wood, turning the sharp small sound into something softer and more diffuse. Edgifbu would notice this change without really noticing it, the way she noticed the shift of the light from the window or the gradual cooling of the lamp as the tallow burned low. And when the sound became too muted, she would pause in her walking and knock the shoe gently against the edge of the wooden frame to dislodge the dust. The dust would fall in a small pale cloud and settle on the earthen floor, and then she would resume her walking, and the sound would be sharper again for a time, until the dust built up once more and the cycle repeated. The other shoe, the one on her right foot, did not strike the runnerboard because the path she walked kept her right foot on the packed earth at all times. The right shoe made a different sound, a softer and more continuous sound of leather brushing against the hard, smooth surface of the earth that had been trodden by so many feet for so many years. This sound was even quieter than the sound of the left shoe, and it was almost impossible to hear beneath the grinding of the stone and the hiss of the meal. But it was there nonetheless, and it contributed to the overall texture of the soundscape in the mill room. The right shoe wore out faster than the left because the earth was more abrasive than the smooth oak of the runnerboard, and Edgifbu would sometimes notice a thin spot developing on the sole, and would know that the miller would need to make her a new pair before the winter was over. The sound of the shoe against the runner was one of the few sounds in the mill room that was entirely within Edgifbu's control, though she did not think of it that way. She could change the sound by walking faster or slower, by pressing her foot down more firmly or more lightly, by pausing for a moment and then resuming her circuit. But she rarely changed anything, because the rhythm that had established itself was the rhythm that worked best with the turning of the stone and the falling of the meal and the steady expenditure of her strength through the long hours of the day. The sound was what it was, and it continued what it continued, and it marked the passage of time in a way that required no thought and no attention and no response beyond the simple continuation of the walking. Sometimes when the grinding had been going on for a long while and her mind had settled into the deep quiet that came with repetitive work, Edgifbu would become aware of the sound of her shoe in a way that she was not usually aware of it. The sound would seem to separate itself from the general noise of the mill room and become distinct and clear, a soft, regular tap that was almost like a voice speaking a single word over and over again in a language that she could not quite understand. This awareness would last for a few moments or a few circuits of the stone, and then it would fade back into the background, and she would no longer hear the sound as a separate thing, but only as part of the whole. The experience was not unpleasant, and it was not particularly meaningful. It was simply something that happened sometimes when the work was long and the light was dim, and the cold had settled deep into the walls. The runnerboard itself had a history that was written in the marks and grooves that covered its surface. The board had been replaced once in Edgifbu's memory, not because it had worn through, but because a knot in the wood had loosened over time and had begun to catch the edge of her shoe and make her stumble. The miller had taken up the old board and had shaped a new one from a straight-grained piece of oak that he had been saving for just such a purpose, and he had fitted it into place and smoothed it with a piece of rough stone until it was as even as the old board had been. The new board had been lighter in colour than the old one, and it had smelled of fresh-cut wood for many weeks. But now it was dark and smooth, and it had taken on the same patina of age and use as everything else in the mill-room. The sound of her shoe on the new board had been slightly different at first, a brighter and sharper tap that had seemed loud in the quiet of the room. But over time the board had absorbed the oils from the leather and the dust from the grain, and the sound had mellowed into the familiar soft scuff that it was now. The children in the village knew the sound of the grinding and the sound of the shoe against the runner, though they did not think about it in those terms. When they passed by the mill-room on their way to gather kindling or to check the snares, they heard the low rumble of the stone and the steady tap of the shoe, and they knew without looking that Eid Giftbu was inside, and that the work of the day was continuing, and that there would be bread when the time came for bread. The sound was a comfort in a way that few things were a comfort in the famine winter, a sign that the ordinary rhythms of life had not been entirely disrupted by the cold and the hunger and the long waiting for spring. The children did not say this to themselves because children do not think in such ways, but they felt it in their bodies, and they carried the feeling with them as they went about their small tasks and returned to the hall to warm their hands at the fire. The sound of the shoe was also a measure of Eid Giftbu's tiredness, though she did not use it that way consciously. At the beginning of the day, when she first took up the handle and began to walk, the sound was crisp and regular, and each tap came exactly when it was expected, without any variation. As the morning wore on and her legs grew heavier and her attention wandered to other things, the sound would sometimes falter for a single step and then recover, a tiny hesitation that would have been imperceptible to anyone but her. By the late afternoon, when the light from the window had faded to a deep blue-grey and a lamp was the only source of illumination in the room, the sound would be slightly slower and slightly softer, and the intervals between taps would be a little longer. She did not hurry to correct this, because hurrying would only make her more tired, and because the grain would be ground eventually, whether she walked fast or slow. The sound simply recorded the passage of her energy from the full store of the morning to the nearly empty store of the evening, and it did so without judgment and without comment. There were times when the sound of the shoe was joined by other small sounds that came from her body as she walked. Her breathing made a soft sound that was audible only when she was close to the end of a long session of grinding, and her lungs were working harder to keep the motion going. Her woolen dress made a faint rustling sound as it moved against her legs and against the wrap that she wore over her shoulders. The joints of her knees and her hips made small creaking sounds sometimes when she had been walking for many hours, and the cold had settled deep into the spaces between her bones. All of these sounds were part of the larger sound of the work, and they blended together into a single quiet noise that was the sound of a person doing what needed to be done in the dim light of a winter afternoon. The sound of the shoe against the runner was not a sound that would last beyond the moment of its making. It rose into the cold air of the mill-room, and it faded immediately into the general hum of the grinding and the hiss of the meal and the faint crackle of the lamp, and then it was gone, and another sound just like it took its place. The sounds accumulated without being counted, and they marked the passing of the day in a way that was more reliable than the shifting of the light from the high window, because the light was faint and variable, and sometimes disappeared entirely behind the thick clouds, while the sound of the shoe continued steadily on. When the grinding was finally done for the day and Eid Giftbu released the handle and stepped back from the quern, the silence that followed was almost shocking in its completeness. The sound of the shoe stopped, and the sound of the stone stopped, and the sound of the meal stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but the small whisper of the lamp and the distant murmur of the village and the profound quiet of the mill-room settling back into itself. Then she would walk to the door and step through into the passage, and the sound of her shoes would change again, becoming the soft scuff of leather on packed earth, and then the faint crunch of frost on the threshold as she entered the hall. The sound of the runnerboard would remain behind in the mill-room, waiting in the silence for the next morning, when she would return and take up the handle and begin to walk again. And the soft regular tap would start once more and continue through all the hours of the day until the work was done and the silence returned. And in this way the sound of the shoe against the runner became one of the steady rhythms that held the village together through the famine winter, a small and unremarkable sound that asked for nothing and promised nothing, but was simply there, marking time in the darkness and the cold, while the stone turned and the meal fell, and the long, slow work of survival went on. The warmth that would eventually bake the flatbreads did not come quickly, and it did not come all at once, but arrived in a slow and patient accumulation that could not be hurried any more than the turning of the quern, or the falling of the meal, or the passing of the winter days themselves. The hearth in the hall was a ring of stones, set into the packed earth floor, and a low fire burned there throughout the day and into the night, fed with lengths of alder and willow, and the occasional piece of deadfall oak that the men had dragged from the forest. The fire was never large because the fuel was precious, and because the famine winter had reduced the village's store of wood as surely as it had reduced the store of grain, and so the flames were kept small and steady, and they gave off a warmth that was felt most strongly by those who sat or lay very close to the stones. Edgifu knew this fire, and she knew the particular stone that served as the baking surface for the flatbreads, a smooth, flat piece of slate that had been chosen long ago for its ability to hold heat and to release it slowly and evenly into the dough pressed against its surface. You might stand near the hearth in the dim light of the hall and watch as the stone absorbed the warmth from the flames that licked around its edges. The stone was dark grey with faint veins of lighter grey running through it like the ghost of some ancient current, and its surface had been worn smooth by countless loaves of bread that had been pressed and turned and lifted from it over the years. When the fire was first lit in the early morning, the stone was cold to the touch, as cold as the earthen floor and the wattle walls and everything else in the village that had not been warmed by the bodies of people or animals. Edgifu would sometimes place her palm flat against the stone in the first hour after the fire was kindled and feel nothing but the deep chill of the slate, a chill that seemed to come from the very center of the earth, and that would not be moved by the small flames that flickered nearby. She would take her hand away and go about the other work of the morning, the grinding and the measuring and the sifting, and she would return to the stone later and place her palm against it again, and feel that the chill had lessened by a degree or two, that the surface was no longer actively cold but merely cool, that the warmth was beginning its long, slow journey from the fire into the heart of the slate. The waiting for the stone to grow warm enough for baking was not a waiting that involved stillness or idleness, because there was always other work to be done, and because standing still in the cold hall would only make the cold settle deeper into the bones. Edgifu moved between the mill room and the hall and the narrow passage that connected them, carrying bowls of meal and handfuls of kindling and the small clay pot of water that sat near the hearth. And each time she passed the fire, she would glance at the baking stone and note, without words, the small changes that marked its slow warming. The color of the stone shifted almost imperceptibly as it heated, the dark grey taking on a slightly warmer tone that was more brown than grey if you looked closely and if the light was right. The surface seemed to open somehow, the tiny pores and fissures in the slate becoming more visible as the heat expanded the stone by fractions that were too small to measure, but that were real nonetheless. The smell of the stone changed too, a faint mineral scent that rose from it as the warmth drove out the last of the moisture that had settled into its surface during the cold of the night. The process of warming the stone was a process that had its own rhythm and its own particular stages, and Edgifu knew these stages in the same way she knew the sound of the quern and the feel of the grain and the measuring cup, and the weight of the grain in the measuring cup and the weight of the sacks on their wooden pegs. The first stage was the cold stage, when the stone was no different from any other stone in the village, a piece of the earth that held no warmth and offered none. This stage lasted through the first hour of the fire, and sometimes longer, if the wood was damp or if the flames were kept especially low to conserve the fuel. The second stage was the warming stage, when the surface of the stone began to lose its chill, and when a hand placed upon it would feel not cold but merely neutral, a temperature that was neither warm nor cool, and that seemed to draw nothing from the skin and give nothing back. This stage lasted through the middle of the morning and into the time when the light from the high window in the mill room was at its brightest, such as brightness was in the deep of winter. The third stage was the ready stage, and this was the stage that Edgifu waited for with a patience that was so deeply learned that it no longer felt like patience at all. In this stage the stone was warm enough that a drop of water flicked onto its surface would sizzle and dance and disappear in a small puff of steam, but not so hot that the dough pressed against it would scorch and blacken before it had a chance to bake through. The temperature was a particular thing that could not be described in words, but that lived in Ed Gifu's hands, and her eyes, and her long experience of baking flatbreads on this same stone through many winters. She knew the ready stage by the way the light played across the surface of the slate, a faint shimmer that was almost like the heat haze that rose from the fields in summer, but much smaller and much more subtle. She knew it by the smell that rose from the stone, a clean hot smell that was like the smell of sun-warmed rock on a hillside, but concentrated and contained within the ring of hearthstones. She knew it by the way her palm felt when she held it a hand's breadth above the surface, the warmth rising in a steady column that pressed against her skin, like a gentle and invisible hand. The waiting for the stone to reach this ready stage was a waiting that happened in the background of all the other work, a quiet awareness that ran beneath the grinding and the sifting and the measuring and the carrying of bowls from one room to another. Ed Gifu did not count the minutes because there were no minutes to count, and because the passage of time was marked instead by the turning of the quern and the shifting of the light and the gradual emptying of the grain sacks on the wall. She simply knew that the stone would be ready when it was ready, and that she would feel that readiness in her body when the moment came. The same way she felt the right consistency of the dough or the right speed of the turning handle. The waiting was not a burden, and it was not an irritation. It was simply another part of the long, slow rhythm of the winter day. While the stone warmed through its various stages, Ed Gifu continued the work of the mill room, walking her circle around the quern and listening to the sound of the grinding and watching the meal fall into the wooden trough. The lamp on the shelf burned its small steady flame, and the light from the high window crept across the wall, and the cold seeped through the wattle, and the sound of her shoe against the runner-board marked the passing of each circuit. She would pause in her walking from time to time, and step into the passage and cross to the hall where the fire burned and the baking stone sat in its place among the hearthstones. And she would stand for a moment and feel the warmth of the flames on her face and her hands, and she would look at the stone and assess its progress. Then she would return to the mill room and take up the handle again and continue the turning, and the stone in the hearth would continue its slow absorption of heat, and the two processes would run alongside each other like two streams that flowed in the same direction but at different speeds. The children in the hall knew the stages of the warming stone as well as Ed Gifu did, though they knew them in a different way and for different reasons. For the children, the warming of the stone meant that bread would come soon, and the coming of bread was the central event of their small hungry days. They would watch the stone from their places near the fire, and they would see the subtle changes in its appearance, and they would feel the warmth beginning to radiate from its surface, and their bellies would tighten with a hope that was both sharp and familiar. The youngest child would sometimes reach out a small hand toward the stone, and Ed Gifu would gently push the hand away, because the stone was hot enough to burn tender skin even before it was hot enough to bake the bread properly. The child would withdraw the hand and wait and watch, and the waiting was a lesson that the Famine winter taught over and over again until it was learned so deeply that it became part of the child's nature. The water in the clay pot near the hearth warmed at the same slow pace as the baking stone, absorbing the heat of the fire through the porous clay and holding it in a way that made the water pleasant to touch but never hot enough to scald. Ed Gifu used this water to mix the dough for the flatbreads, and the warmth of the water helped the flour to come together into a mass that was easier to knead and shape than it would have been with cold water from the stream. The pot itself was a simple thing that had been made by a potter in a village many miles to the south, a village that traded its pots for wool and grain in the years before the famine, when there was surplus enough for trade. The pot was a warm brown color, with a band of simple cross-hatched lines incised around its middle, and it sat on a flat stone near the edge of the fire where the flames could reach it, but not overwhelm it. The water inside was never still because the heat of the fire created small currents that moved through the pot in slow and invisible circles, and if you looked closely at the surface, you could see the faint shimmer of these currents as they rose and fell and rose again. The waiting for the stone to warm was a waiting that had been repeated so many times that it had become a kind of ritual, though Ed Gifu would not have called it that, because she had no word for ritual and no need to name the things that were simply the shape of her days. She would finish the grinding of a bowl of grain and sift the meal and store the flour in the chest, and then she would walk to the hall and stand by the fire and hold her hands out to the warmth, and feel the hens out to the warmth, and feel the heat sinking into her fingers and her palms and the ache in her knuckles that came from gripping the wooden handle for so many hours. She would look at the baking stone and see that it was nearly ready, that the surface had taken on that particular quality of warmth that meant the dough would seize and bubble and begin to brown within a few heartbeats of touching it. And she would know that the next part of the day's work was about to begin. The part that would turn the flour into bread and the bread into warmth for the bellies of the village. The dough was made in a wooden bowl that sat on the floor near the hearth, a bowl that was larger than the one she used in the mill room, and that was dark and smooth from the oils of many batches of dough. Edgifu would measure flour from the chest into this bowl using the same careful scoop that she used for all her measuring, and she would add a pinch of salt from the small clay pot that held the village's precious store of the greyish crystals. The salt had come from a place far to the east where the sea met the land and where people gathered the white crust from the rocks and traded it inland for things that the coastal people could not grow or make. The salt was precious, and it was used sparingly, just enough to give the flatbreads a faint savour that made the dense crumb more pleasant to eat, and that helped the body hold on to the water that was drunk from the stream. Edgifu would mix the flour and the salt together with her fingers, and then she would make a hollow in the centre and pour in a small amount of the warm water from the clay pot, and then she would begin to work the mixture with her hands, folding and pressing and turning until the flour and water became a single mass of dough that was smooth on the outside and slightly sticky within. The kneading was a different kind of work from the grinding, a work that used different muscles and a different rhythm, and that produced a different set of sounds. The dough made a soft, wet sound as it was pressed and folded, a sound that was almost like the sound of footsteps in wet snow, but quieter and more contained. Edgifu's hands moved in a steady pattern, pushing the dough away from her with the heels of her palms, and then folding it back toward herself and turning it a quarter turn and pushing again. The motion was repetitive and calming, and it required just enough attention to keep the mind from wandering too far into the cold and hungry places beyond the walls. The dough grew warmer under her hands from the heat of her own body and from the warmth of the water that had been mixed into it, and it became more elastic and more cohesive as the gluten strands that lived in the rye and barley flour were coaxed into alignment by the pressure and the motion. When the dough was ready, Edgifu would divide it into portions that were as equal as her eye and her hands could make them, and she would shape each portion into a flat round that was no thicker than her smallest finger. The rounds were placed on a wooden board that had been dusted with a little flour to keep them from sticking, and they sat there while the baking stone finished its slow approach to the perfect temperature. Edgifu would test the stone one more time by flicking a few drops of water from her fingertips onto its surface, and she would watch the drops sizzle and dance and disappear in small puffs of steam that rose and twisted in the warm air above the hearth. The sound of the water hitting the hot stone was a sharp, quick hiss that was over almost before it began, and it was the signal that the waiting was done and the baking could begin. The first round of dough was lifted from the board and laid carefully on the hot stone, and it began to change almost immediately. The surface that touched the stone dried and firmed and took on a slightly darker color, and small bubbles formed in the thin places where the dough was not perfectly even. The smell of baking bread rose into the air and filled the hall and mixed with the smell of wood smoke and wool and the cold, clean scent that seeped in through the walls. The children who had been waiting and watching drew closer to the hearth, their faces lit by the firelight and their eyes fixed on the changing dough, and they said nothing because there was nothing to say when bread was baking and hunger was waiting just beneath the surface of every moment. Edgifu watched the bread as it baked, and she turned it once with a flat stick of wood so that both sides would brown evenly, and when it was done, she lifted it from the stone and set it on the wooden board to cool for a moment before it was divided. The bread was dark and dense, and it steamed in the cold air of the hall, and it was followed by the next round and the next, until all the dough had been baked and the flatbreads lay in a warm stack on the board. The waiting was over now, and the bread was here, and the children would eat and the adults would eat, and the small warmth of the food would spread through their bellies and then fade, leaving behind only the memory of having eaten and the knowledge that the next waiting had already begun. The baking stone would remain warm for a long time after the last bread was lifted from its surface, holding the heat of the fire and the dense slate, and releasing it slowly into the cold air of the hall. Edgifu would sometimes place her palm near the stone in the late afternoon when the light was fading and the fire was burning low, and she would feel the warmth still rising from it, a faint and gentle heat that was like the memory of the baking and the promise of the next baking to come. The stone would cool through the evening and into the night, and by morning it would be cold again, as cold as the earthen floor and the wattle walls, and the long wait for its warmth would begin once more, with the kindling of the fire and the slow, patient absorption of heat that could not be hurried and would not be rushed. And in this way, the waiting and the warming and the baking became another of the steady rhythms that held the village together through the famine winter. A rhythm that was as old as the stones themselves, and as patient as the cold that waited outside the walls. The flatbreads that came from the baking stone did not disappear all at once into the waiting mouths of the village, but were instead distributed in a careful and deliberate way that had been worked out over many weeks of the famine winter, and that balanced the immediate demands of hunger against the longer demands of survival. Some of the loaves were eaten warm from the stone, broken into pieces and handed to the children and the old woman and the young mother with the baby, and anyone else who was present in the hall at the moment when the baking was done. These warm pieces were the only heat that many of the villagers would feel inside their bodies for the rest of the day, a small and temporary warmth that spread from the stomach outward and then faded into the general cold of the winter afternoon. But not all the loaves were eaten at once, and some were set aside and stored against the coming days, placed in a particular spot where they would keep and where they could be counted and recounted in the quiet manner that had become as much a part of Eadgifcu's work as the grinding and the sifting and the turning of the stone. You might stand in the hall near the wall that was farthest from the hearth and notice a wooden shelf that had been fixed to the timber studs with pegs of oak, a shelf that was wide and deep and that held the stored loaves of the village. The shelf was high enough that the dogs could not reach it, and low enough that Eadgifcu could lift the loaves up and take them down without straining, and it was positioned in a place where the air was cool and dry, and where the bread would not grow mouldy before it was needed. The loaves sat on the shelf in a row that was never quite straight, because the loaves themselves were never quite round, and because the surface of the shelf had warped slightly over the years and created small hollows and rises that the loaves settled into according to their individual shapes. The row of loaves was a dark line against the lighter wood of the shelf and against the greyish daub of the wall behind it, and it was one of the first things that Eadgifo saw when she entered the hall from the dark passage that led to the mill room. The loaves were flat and round, and they were the colour of the rye and barley flour from which they had been made, a deep greyish brown that was darker on the bottom where the hot stone had seared the dough and lighter on the top where the steam had escaped through small cracks and fissures. The surface of each loaf was marked with a faint pattern of the stone's texture, a pattern that was like a fingerprint, and that identified the bread as having been baked on this particular hearth and this particular slate and by these particular hands. The edges of the loaves were slightly thicker than the centres, and they had a faint chewiness that the children liked and that they would save for last when they ate their portions, holding the edge in their mouths and working it slowly with their teeth until it softened and released its small store of flavour. The centres were thinner and crisper, and they shattered into fragments when broken, and these fragments were gathered carefully from the wooden board and eaten one by one, so that nothing was wasted. Eadgifu did not count the loaves in the way that a person might count sheep or measures of grain, by assigning a number to each one and adding them together to reach a sum. The loaves were not numbers to her, because numbers were not a part of her world in that way, and the knowledge of how many loaves remained on the shelf was a knowledge that lived in her eyes and her hands, and the deep familiar awareness that came from looking at the same shelf every day and seeing the row of loaves grow shorter as the winter passed. She knew the look of a shelf that held enough bread for several days, and she knew the look of a shelf that held enough bread for only tomorrow, and she knew the look of a shelf that was beginning to worry her, even though she did not name the worry, or dwell on it, or allow it to change the steady rhythm of her work. The counting was a quiet thing that happened in the background of her attention while she did other things, a kind of seeing that required no effort and no thought, and that simply noted the state of the shelf in the same way it noted the state of the fire or the state of the light from the high window. The loaves were stored in a particular order that was not an order of size or shape or age, but simply the order in which they had been placed on the shelf after each baking. The newest loaves went on the left end of the row, and the older loaves were shifted to the right, and when a loaf was taken down to be eaten, it was taken from the right end, where the oldest bread waited. This order ensured that no loaf sat on the shelf for too long, and that the bread was always eaten before it grew too hard or too stale, though in the deep of the famine winter, the bread never lasted long enough to grow truly stale and was always eaten within a few days of its baking. The shifting of the loaves was a small motion that Edgifpu performed without thinking whenever she added new bread to the shelf, her hands moving the older loaves to the right with a gentle pressure and settling the new loaves into the space that had been created on the left. The loaves made a soft, dry sound as they slid against the wood of the shelf, a sound like the rustle of dried leaves or the whisper of grain pouring into the eye of the quern. The quiet counting happened at various times throughout the day, and it was never a deliberate act, but rather a kind of noticing that occurred when her eyes passed over the shelf in the course of her other tasks. In the morning, when she first entered the hall after the early grinding and the kindling of the fire, her gaze would find the shelf, and she would see the row of loaves, and she would know, without counting, that there were enough for the day ahead, and perhaps for the next day as well. In the middle of the day, when she brought a new batch of flatbreads from the hearth and placed them on the shelf, she would see the row grow slightly longer, and she would feel a small quiet satisfaction that was too faint to be called relief, but that was nonetheless present in the back of her mind. In the evening, when the last meal of the day had been eaten and the children were settling into their sleeping places and the fire was burning low, she would look at the shelf one more time, and she would see the row of loaves in the dim orange light, and she would know what the morning would bring and what the work of the next day would be. The shelf itself was a simple construction of planed oak boards that the miller had made in a winter much like this one, but long before the famine had settled over the land. The boards were thick, and they were supported by wooden brackets that had been carved with a few simple lines for no reason other than that the miller's hands liked to make things that were pleasing to look at as well as useful. The shelf had darkened with age, and with the smoke from the hearth, and with the fine dust of flour that settled on everything in the hall, and it had taken on a deep, warm brown color that was almost black in the shadows, and that glowed faintly when the firelight caught it. The surface of the shelf was smooth from the passage of many loaves and many hands over many years, and it bore the faint marks of the bread that had rested there, small crumbs and traces of flour that had become embedded in the grain of the wood, and that would never be entirely removed. The loaves themselves were not all identical, even though they were made from the same flour and the same water and the same pinch of salt, and were baked on the same stone by the same hands. Each loaf had its own slight variations, a place where the dough had been a little thinner or a little thicker, a spot where the stone had been a little hotter or a little cooler, a crack that had opened in a particular direction as the steam escaped. Edgifpu knew these variations without studying them, and she could recognize individual loaves if she needed to, though she rarely needed to, because the loaves were all destined for the same purpose and would all be eaten in the same way and would all provide the same small measure of sustenance to the same hungry bellies. The variations were simply part of the nature of bread, and they were accepted without comment, the way the variations in the grain were accepted, or the variations in the cold, from one day to the next. The quiet counting extended beyond the shelf to the other stores that the village kept against the long winter. There was the oak chest in the mill room that held the ground flour, and Edgifpu knew the level of the flour in that chest as surely as she knew the row of loaves on the shelf. There were the sacks of whole grain on the wooden pegs, and she knew the weight of those sacks and the sound they made when she reached into them and the number of days they would last at the current rate of grinding. There was the small clay pot of salt and the smaller clay pot of dried herbs that were used to flavour the porridge when there were herbs to be had, and there was the stack of kindling beside the hearth and the pile of larger wood outside the door. All of these things were counted in the same quiet way, not with numbers, but with the deep familiar awareness that came from seeing them every day and noting the small changes that marked the passage of time and the slow consumption of the village's resources. The children counted too in their own way, though their counting was less patient and less accepting than Edgifpu's. They knew exactly how many loaves were on the shelf at any given time because they looked at the shelf often, and because the loaves were the center of their small, hungry world. They knew when a loaf had been taken down and divided, and they knew when a new batch of bread had been added to the row, and they could feel the difference between a shelf that held many loaves and a shelf that held few. Their counting was more urgent than Edgifpu's because their bellies were smaller, and their hunger was sharper, and their understanding of the long, slow rhythm of survival was not yet fully formed. They would look at the shelf, and they would feel the tightness in their stomachs, and they would wait for the moment when the next loaf would be taken down and broken and handed to them in pieces that were never quite large enough to make the hunger go away entirely. The quiet counting was not a source of anxiety for Edgipu, because anxiety was a luxury that the famine winter did not allow, and because worry would not make the loaves multiply or the grain sacks refill themselves. The counting was simply a form of attention, a way of being present with the things that mattered and of knowing where the village stood in relation to the long, slow arc of the winter. When the shelf was full or nearly full after a fresh baking, she noted this fullness, and she allowed herself to feel the small easing that came with it, a slight loosening of the tension that lived in her shoulders and her jaw, and that she was not usually aware of until it lessened. When the shelf was growing bare and the row of loaves was short, and the right end of the shelf was empty because all the older bread had been eaten, she noted this bareness, and she adjusted her sense of the days ahead without changing anything about her work, because her work was already as careful and as steady as it could be. There were times when the quiet counting became more deliberate, when Edgifu would stand before the shelf and let her eyes move slowly across the row of loaves, and feel the weight of each one in her mind, even though she did not touch them. She would note the loaf that was slightly smaller than the others, and she would know that it would be the next one taken down, because the smaller loaves were always eaten first, and the larger loaves were saved for the days when the hunger was sharpest. She would note the loaf that had a small crack running across its surface, and she would know that it would break unevenly when it was divided, and that someone would get a slightly larger piece and someone would get a slightly smaller piece, and that this was simply the way of things and not a matter for concern. She would note the loaf that was the last of a previous baking and that sat alone at the right end of the row, slightly harder and slightly drier than the others, and she would know that it would be eaten that evening with the porridge, and that its dryness would be softened by the warm liquid, and that no one would complain. The quiet counting happened also when she was not in the hall, and when the shelf was not visible to her eyes. She carried the image of the shelf with her into the mill room, and she could see the row of loaves in her mind while she walked her circle around the quern and listened to the sound of the grinding and felt the handle move under her hand. The loaves were a steady presence in the back of her awareness, a small warm glow that was like the glow of the lamp on its shelf, but more diffuse and more constant. They were the reason for the grinding, and the reason for the sifting, and the reason for the careful measuring of the grain that remained in the sacks on the wall. Every turn of the stone was a turn toward the next baking, and every bowl of meal that fell into the trough was a bowl that would become flour, and then dough, and then bread, and then another loaf on the shelf, and another small measure of time added to the village's account against the hunger of the winter. The shelf was never entirely empty because Edgifu managed the stores with a care that bordered on instinct, always keeping back at least one loaf, even when the grain was running low and the next baking was uncertain. The last loaf on the shelf was a kind of promise, a small dark round of bread that sat alone at the right end of the row, and that seemed to hold within its dense crumb all the hope that the village could muster in the deep of the famine winter. When the last loaf was finally taken down and divided and eaten, it was because a new batch of bread had already been baked and was cooling on the wooden board and would soon take its place on the shelf, shifting the row to the right and beginning the cycle again. The last loaf was never the last loaf for long because the work continued and the stone turned and the meal fell and the fire warmed the baking stone and the dough was mixed and kneaded and pressed flat and laid on the hot slate and the smell of bread rose into the cold air of the hall and another loaf was added to the row on the shelf. Edgifu stood in the hall in the late afternoon while the light from the smoke hole in the roof faded from grey to deeper grey and the fire in the hearth settled into a bed of glowing coals. The shelf was visible in the dim light, and the row of loaves was a dark line against the wood. 7 loaves, now after the day's baking and the day's eating. 7 loaves was neither many nor few, but simply what there was, and she looked at them and felt their presence and knew that they would be enough for the evening meal and the morning meal, and perhaps a little beyond. The quiet counting was done for now, and the shelf would keep its own counsel through the night, the loaves sitting in the darkness and the cold and waiting for the next day's hands to take them down and break them and share them out. And Edgifu turned from the shelf and walked back through the dark passage to the mill room where the quern sat silent, and the lamp burned low, and the work of the next day waited in the sacks on the wall, and in the grain dust that covered everything, and in the deep, patient cold that would greet her when she returned in the morning, to begin the turning once more. The circle that Eadgifu walked around the quern was not large, and it did not vary, and it had been worn into the packed earth floor by so many footsteps over so many years that it had become a permanent feature of the mill room, like the stones themselves or the wooden pegs on the wall. The circle was perhaps 4 paces in its full circumference if you measured it with the stride of a person who was not hurrying and not lingering, but simply walking at the steady pace that the turning of the stone required. The path was slightly sunken into the surrounding earth, because the weight of countless steps had compressed the soil, and because the fine dust of grain that fell from the trough had been trodden into the surface and had bound the particles together into a hard, smooth layer that was different in color and texture from the rest of the floor. The circle was a darker brown than the earth around it, and it had a faint sheen in the lamplight like the sheen on the surface of a still pond when the sky is overcast and the light is low and diffuse. You might stand in the corner of the mill room near the oak chest and watch as Eadgifu walked this circle again and again and again, her feet finding the familiar path without any need for her eyes to guide them. Her body knew the circle in a way that was deeper than memory, a knowledge that lived in her muscles and her bones and the soles of her feet, and that did not require any thought or attention or intention. She could have walked the circle in complete darkness, and she would not have stumbled or strayed, because the path was as familiar to her as the shape of her own hands or the sound of her own breathing. The circle was the shape of her days, and it was the shape of the work, and it was the shape of the survival that the village clung to through the long, cold months of the famine winter. The repetition of the circle was not a repetition that grew dull or wearisome in the way that a person might expect repetition to grow dull. Instead, it became a kind of quiet that settled over the mind and smoothed away the rough edges of thought, and left only the steady rhythm of the walking and the turning and the falling of the meal. Eadgifu did not think about the circle while she walked it, because thinking about the circle would have been like thinking about her own heartbeat or the movement of her lungs, an unnecessary attention to something that functioned perfectly well without any notice. She simply walked, and the circle simply was, and the two things existed together in a state of quiet agreement that asked for nothing and explained nothing and continued without end. The beginning of the circle was not marked in any visible way because the circle had no beginning and no end, but was simply a continuous loop that she entered and left at the same place each time, the place where the wooden handle of the quern projected from the side of the runner stone. She would place her right hand on the handle and her left hand on the edge of the wooden frame, and then she would step forward with her right foot and the circle would begin. The first step took her past the front of the quern, where the meal fell into the wooden trough, and where she would sometimes pause to push the accumulating meal forward with a small beechwood paddle. The second step took her around the side of the quern, where the light from the lamp on the shelf fell across her path and cast her shadow against the wattle wall in a shape that moved and shifted and repeated. The third step brought her back to the starting place, and the handle had completed a portion of its rotation, and the stone had turned a corresponding amount, and the grain inside had been crushed a little further, and the meal had fallen a little more. And then she stepped forward again with her right foot, and the circle began again, and again, and again. The circle was always the same, and yet it was never exactly the same, because the light changed, and the sound changed, and the feel of the handle under her hand changed slightly as the grain inside the quern was reduced from whole kernels to coarse meal to fine flour. At the beginning of a fresh measure of grain, the handle was harder to push because the whole kernels offered more resistance to the turning of the stone, and Eadgifu would lean into the work with a little more weight, and her steps would be a little slower and more deliberate. As the grain was crushed and the resistance lessened, the handle would move more easily, and her steps would lighten, and the circle would seem to turn a little faster, though she never consciously changed her pace. Her body made these adjustments without her mind's involvement because her body had learned the feel of grain being ground over so many winters that it knew what to do in the same way that a bird knows how to build a nest, or a stream knows how to find its way downhill. The circle was worn into the floor in a way that was visible if you knew where to look, and if the light was bright enough to show the slight depression of the path. The depression was deepest at the place where her right foot landed with each step, because the right foot carried more of her weight as she leaned into the handle, and it was shallowest at the place where her left foot crossed the wooden runner board and made the soft scuffing sound that was as much a part of the mill room's music as the grinding itself. The path was smooth and hard, and it had been polished by the passage of leather soles until it reflected the lamplight in a faint, dull gleam that was almost like the gleam of water in a deep well. Small cracks radiated outward from the path where the pressure of her steps had caused the packed earth to settle and shift over the years. And these cracks were filled with the fine pale dust of grain that had sifted down into them, and that gave them the appearance of tiny dry stream beds running away from the main channel of her walking. The repetition of the circle was a repetition that extended beyond the individual days and into the weeks and months and years of her life in this village. She had walked this circle in winters, when the grain was plentiful and the sacks were full and the shelf in the hall held more loaves than could be eaten before they grew stale. She had walked this circle in winters when the grain was scarce and the sacks were light and the shelf held only a few dark rounds of bread that were divided into smaller and smaller pieces as the weeks passed. She had walked this circle when she was young and strong and new to the village and the work, and she had walked it when she was older and her knees ached in the cold and her hands grew stiff more quickly than they once had. The circle did not change because the circle was not something that could change. It was simply the shape of the work, and the work was simply what needed to be done, and the doing of it was the thread that connected all the days together into a single long fabric of survival. The children sometimes came to the door of the mill room and watched her walk the circle, their small faces appearing in the dim opening and their eyes following her as she moved around the quern. They did not speak, because there was nothing to say about a woman walking in a circle, and because the sound of the grinding filled the air and made speech difficult. They simply watched, and after a time they would turn away and return to the hall or to the cold outside, carrying with them the image of the circle and the sound of the stone, and the knowledge that the work was continuing and that bread would come. The watching was a kind of learning, even though no words were exchanged. A learning that happened in the body and the eyes, and that taught the children something about patience and repetition, and the way that survival was built from small repeated actions that added up to something larger than themselves. The circle was not the only circle in the mill room or in the village or in the world of the famine winter. The quern itself was a circle, and the stones that composed it were circles, and the wooden frame that held them was built around a circular shape. The eye of the stone where the grain was poured was a circle, and the trough that caught the falling meal was curved in a circle around the base of the quern. The lamp on the shelf cast a circle of light on the wall, and the high window was a rough circle cut into the wattle and covered with oiled linen. Outside the mill room, the sun followed its own circle through the sky even though the clouds hid it from view, and the seasons turned in their great slow circle from winter to spring to summer to autumn and back to winter again. All of these circles were connected in ways that Edgipu did not think about, but that she felt in her body as she walked, a sense of being part of something that was larger than herself, and that had been turning since long before she was born, and would continue turning long after she was gone. The repetition of the circle had a quality that was almost like the repetition of a breath or a heartbeat, a rhythm that was so steady and so fundamental that it became a kind of silence rather than a sound. When Edgifu had been walking for a long while, and her mind had settled into the deep quiet that came with repetitive work, the circle seemed to disappear, and she was no longer aware of walking or turning or grinding, but was simply present in a state of calm attention that had no object and no subject and no boundary between herself and the work. The handle moved under her hand, and her feet moved along the path, and the stone turned and the meal fell, and all of these things happened without anyone doing them, because the doing and the doer had become a single thing that could not be separated. This state did not last, and it could not be sought or held onto. It simply came. When it came and went, when it went and left behind a residue of quiet that lingered in her mind even after she stopped walking and released the handle and stepped away from the quern. The circle was interrupted sometimes by the small necessities of the work, the need to pour more grain into the eye, or to push the meal forward in the trough, or to adjust the lamp when the wick burned too low. These interruptions were not breaks in the circle, but were rather part of the circle's larger rhythm. Moments when the walking paused and then resumed and the continuity of the work was maintained across the small gap of stillness. Edgifu would stop and do what needed to be done, and then she would place her hand back on the handle and find her place in the path and begin to walk again, and the circle would continue as if it had never been broken, because in some sense it had never been broken. It had only waited for her return. The circle was measured not in distance or in time, but in the amount of grain that passed through the stones and became meal. A full bowl of mixed rye and barley would require many circles to be ground, more circles than anyone had ever counted, because counting the circles would have served no purpose and would have interrupted the quiet attention that the work required. The bowl would be full at the start, and then it would be empty, and the trough would be full of meal, and then the sifting would separate the flour from the bran, and then another bowl of grain would be poured, and the circle would begin again. The days were made of these cycles of grinding and sifting and baking, and the cycles were made of circles, and the circles were made of steps, and the steps were made of the small movements of muscle and bone that carried her around and around the quern, while the winter passed outside the walls. The path of the circle was not perfectly smooth, because the earthen floor had small irregularities that had been pressed into it over time. A slight rise here and a shallow dip there that her feet knew and accommodated without any conscious adjustment. There was a place near the back of the quern where a small stone was embedded in the earth, and where her left foot would land a little differently to avoid the hardness of it. There was a place near the front where the path crossed a slight depression that had been caused by water dripping from the thatch in a spring many years ago, before the roof had been repaired. These small variations were not obstacles, but were rather landmarks that her body recognized and that helped to orient her in the endless repetition of the circle. Small reminders that the path was real, and that she was moving through a real space, and that the work was real even when her mind had drifted far away into the quiet that lay beneath thought. The circle continued through the morning and into the afternoon, and the light from the high window moved across the wall and down toward the floor, and the lamp on the shelf burned its steady flame, and the cold seeped through the wattle, and the sound of the grinding filled the room. Edgifu walked, and the handle turned, and the stone ground, and the meal fell, and the circle repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated without ending. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air, and her shoe made its soft sound against the runner board, and her woolen dress rustled against her legs, and all of these small sounds joined together into the single sound of the work continuing, a sound that was as steady and as patient as the turning of the earth itself. When the bowl of grain was empty and the trough was full and the time for sifting had come, Edgifu would stop walking and release the handle and step away from the quern. The circle would pause and the silence would rush in to fill the space where the grinding had been, a silence that was deep and complete and that seemed to press against her ears from all sides. She would stand for a moment in that silence and feel the absence of the motion in her legs and her arms, a faint echo of the walking that continued in her muscles even after she had stopped. Then she would turn to the table where the sieve waited and the linen was spread, and the next part of the work would begin. But the circle was not gone, it was only waiting. And when the sifting was done and the flour was stored and the next bowl of grain was measured and poured into the eye of the stone, she would place her hand back on the handle and find the path with her feet, and the circle would resume as if it had never been interrupted. The repetition of the same small circle was the heart of the work, and the heart of the winter, and the heart of the survival that the village clung to through the cold and the hunger. The circle asked for nothing but patience, and it gave nothing but the slow transformation of grain into flour. And yet this was enough, because this was what there was, and because the circle would continue as long as there was grain to grind, and a hand to turn the handle, and feet to walk the path. Edgifu walked, and the stone turned, and the meal fell, and the circle repeated, and in the repetition there was a kind of peace that had nothing to do with comfort or ease or the absence of hardship. A peace that came simply from doing what needed to be done in the way that it had always been done, and would always be done as long as there were people to do it. The last of the grinding had been done for the day, and the handle of the quern was still, and the stones were silent, and the only sound in the mill room was the faint whisper of the lamp on its shelf, and the distant murmur of the village, settling into the long darkness of the winter night. Edgifu had carried the final bowl of sifted flour to the oak chest, and she had closed the heavy lid, and she had hung the sieve on its nail, and she had swept the loose meal from the table into her palm and scattered it back into the trough, where it would wait for the next day's work. The mill room was tidy in the way that she always left it. not because tidiness was a virtue, but because the work of the next morning would begin more easily if the tools were in their places and the surfaces were clear and the path around the quern was free of anything that might catch her foot as she walked. The tidy room was a quiet room, and the quiet room was a room at rest, and the rest of the room was a rest that she would share when she finally lay down in the hall and let the darkness take her into the shallow sleep that was all anyone could manage in the deep of the famine winter. You might stand in the doorway of the mill room after Eadgifu had left, and watch as the stillness settled over everything like a second layer of cold, a stillness that was so complete and so profound that it seemed to have a texture of its own. The lamp still burned on its shelf because she would return in a moment to extinguish it after she had seen to the fire in the hall, and made sure that the children were covered and the animals were quiet. The small flame cast a circle of orange light on the wattle wall and on the edge of the quern's wooden frame and on the surface of the packed earth floor, where the path of her walking was visible as a faint dark line in the dust. And in that circle of light something was happening that happened every night and that no one ever saw, a slow and patient movement that was almost too subtle to be called movement at all, but that was none the less real and continuous, and as much a part of the mill room as the stones themselves. The dust was settling. The fine pale powder that had risen into the air during the hours of grinding and sifting and pouring and walking, the dust that had hung in the still cold air like a soft mist made of grain and stone, and the patient labor of a woman's hands, was now drifting slowly downward toward the floor, and the chest and the quern and every other surface in the room. The dust moved so slowly that you could not see it move if you watched it directly, the way you cannot see the hour hand of a water clock move if you stare at it. But if you looked away, and then looked back after a long while, you would see that the dust had settled a little more, that the film on the table was a little thicker, that the faint footprints she had left when she walked to the door were a little less distinct. The dust was returning to the earth from which it had been raised, completing a small and silent cycle that had begun when the grain was poured into the eye of the stone, and that would end in the deep stillness of the night when every particle had found its resting place. The dust settled in different ways on different surfaces, according to the nature of the surface and the angle at which it met the falling particles. On the smooth dark wood of the table, the dust formed an even layer that was like a very fine snow that had fallen straight down on a windless night, a layer that was pale against the dark and that showed the faint marks where the bowl had sat and where her hands had rested. On the rough surface of the wattle wall, the dust caught in the crevices between the woven hazel rods and in the cracks of the daub, and it built up in small drifts that followed the contours of the wall like snow caught in the furrows of a ploughed field. On the stones of the quern the dust settled into the grooves and the hollows and the places where the two stones met, filling the tiny spaces with a pale powder that would be ground again into the next day's meal and would become part of the bread and part of the people who ate it. On the packed earth of the floor, the dust simply merged with the soil and became indistinguishable from it, adding another thin layer to the accumulation of years and seasons and generations of grinding. The dust that settled on the lamp itself was a special case, because the lamp was warm and the warmth created a small current of air that rose from the flame and carried the finest particles upward before they could settle. These particles danced in the column of warm air above the lamp, tiny specks of light that swirled and rose and fell and rose again in a slow and endless motion that was like the motion of the stars in the night sky, but contained within the small space of the mill room. Eadgifu had watched these dancing specks many times in the quiet moments after the work was done, standing with her hand on the door frame and her eyes resting on the lamp while her mind rested on nothing at all. The specks were beautiful, in a way that she did not name, because beauty was not something that had a place in the daily work of survival, but she felt it nonetheless in the small, quiet space behind her thoughts. The sound of the dust settling was no sound at all, or it was a sound so faint that no human ear could hear it, a sound that existed only in the imagination as a kind of soft sigh that the room made as it released the day's labor and prepared for the night's rest. The real sounds of the mill room at night were few, and they came from outside or from the slow cooling of the building itself. The wind pressed against the wattle walls and made the whole structure creak and settle in a long, slow rhythm that was like the breathing of some large and patient animal. The frost formed on the outside of the thatch and made a faint crackling sound that was too distant to be heard, but that could be felt as a slight tension in the air. the embers in the hall's hearth shifted and settled and sent small puffs of smoke up through the roof hole, and the smell of the smoke drifted through the passage and into the mill room, where it mixed with the smell of grain dust and cold stone and the faint animal scent of the tallow lamp. Edgifu returned to the mill room after she had seen to the hall and the fire and the sleeping bodies of the village. She crossed the dark passage with the sure steps of long familiarity, and she pushed open the rough door and stood for a moment in the doorway while the lamp's small flame welcomed her back. The room was as she had left it, and yet it was different because the stillness of the night had begun its work, and the dust had settled a little more, and the cold had deepened by a degree or two. She walked to the shelf and stood before the lamp and looked at the small flame that had burned through all the hours of the day's work, the flame that had been her companion in the dim light and that had asked for nothing but a little tallow and a trimmed wick. She cupped her hand behind the flame and blew gently across the top of the clay bowl, and the flame flickered once and then went out, leaving a small trail of smoke that rose and twisted and then disappeared into the darkness. The darkness that followed was complete and absolute, and it filled the mill room like water filling a vessel. Edgifu stood in the darkness and let her eyes adjust to the absence of light, even though there was nothing to see and no reason to stay. She could feel the presence of the quern in the center of the room, a large and solid mass of stone and wood that was darker than the darkness around it. She could feel the presence of the sacks on their pegs and the chest in the corner and the table against the wall, all of them waiting in the dark for the return of the light and the resumption of the work. She could feel the cold settling deeper into her bones, now that she was standing still, and the small warmth of the lamp was gone. A cold that was familiar and patient, and that would be with her through the night and into the morning when she rose to kindle the fire and begin the work again. She turned and walked back through the door and pulled it close behind her, and the mill room was left alone in the darkness, with the dust and the stones and the cold. The dust continued to settle in the silence, particle by particle and hour by hour, a slow and patient return to the earth that was as old as the grinding of grain itself. The stones of the quern cooled slowly, and the wood of the frame contracted in the cold and made small creaking sounds with the only voice of the room in the long hours of the night. The sacks hung on their pegs, and the empty sack swayed slightly in a draught that found its way through the crack beneath the door and then was still again. The chest held its store of flour in the darkness, and the table held its thin layer of dust, and the path around the quern waited for the return of the feet that would walk it again when the light returned. Outside the mill room, the village slept or tried to sleep in the deep cold of the famine winter. The hall was dark except for the faint red glow of the embers in the hearth, and the bodies of the people lay under piles of wool and hides and straw, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, and their dreams filled with images of food and warmth and the green fields of summer that seemed so distant now. The animals in the byre shifted and lowed softly in their sleep, and their bodies gave off a small warmth that helped to keep the cold at bay. The stream was frozen and silent, and the trees stood bare against the starry sky, and the snow lay deep on the fields where the grain would grow again when the winter finally released its grip. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath and waiting for the return of the light and the warmth and the slow green stirring of spring. Edgifu lay down in her place near the hearth and pulled the woolen wrap close around her shoulders and closed her eyes and let the tiredness of the day settle over her like a heavy blanket. Her body still held the rhythm of the walking and the turning, a faint echo of the circle that continued in her muscles and her bones even as she lay still. She could feel the shape of the handle in her palm and the texture of the wooden frame under her left hand and the slight give of the packed earth beneath her feet. She could hear the sound of the grinding and the hiss of the meal and the soft scuff of her shoe against the runnerboard, sounds that were not real but that played in her memory like a song that had no end. She did not think about the day that had passed or the day that was coming, because thinking was too active, and her mind was settling now like the dust in the mill room, drifting slowly down into the quiet that lay beneath thought. The night passed in its slow and silent way, and the dust in the mill room completed its journey to the floor and the table and the stones. The particles that had been raised by the grinding and the sifting and the walking came to rest one by one in the darkness, and the cold, joining the layers of dust that had settled on previous nights and that would be joined by the dust of nights to come. The dust was a record of the work, and it was also a kind of promise, a sign that the grinding would continue and the meal would fall, and the bread would be baked, and the village would endure through the winter and into the spring and the summer beyond. The dust asked for nothing, and it remembered nothing, and it was simply there, a fine pale film that covered everything, and that would be disturbed again when the light returned and the work began anew. The first light of the winter dawn crept through the high window in the mill-room wall, a light that was more grey than gold, and that seemed to hesitate at the threshold as if unsure whether it was welcome. The light fell on the opposite wall and then slowly descended toward the floor and the table and the quern, revealing the shapes of things that had been hidden in the darkness. The dust on the table was visible now as a pale, even layer, and the dust on the floor showed the faint marks where Egif's feet had walked, and where the door had swung open and closed. The stones of the quern were grey and cold, and they waited in the center of the room with the patience of things that had waited through many winters and would wait through many more. The village stirred, and the fire in the hall was rekindled, and the sounds of the day began again, the sound of the axe, and the sound of voices, and the sound of the animals in the byre. Edgifi rose from her sleeping place and wrapped her woolen dress around her and walked through the cold passage to the mill-room. She pushed open the door and stood in the threshold and looked at the familiar shapes of the quern, and the sacks, and the chest, and the table. The dust was settled, and the room was still, and everything was as it had been, and as it would be again. She walked to the shelf and lit the lamp with a coal from the hearth, and the small flame caught and grew and pushed back the darkness. She looked at the quern, and she looked at the sacks on the wall, and she looked at the path worn into the earthen floor. Then she placed her hand on the wooden handle, and she poured the first measure of grain into the eye of the stone, and she began to walk. The sound of the grinding rose up and filled the room, and the dust rose into the air and began its slow dance in the lamplight. The circle continued, and the meal fell, and the day began again in the same way that it had begun on all the days before, and would begin on all the days to come. And in the mill-room the dust would rise and settle and rise again, a quiet witness to the work and the waiting and the slow patient endurance of the famine winter.